There is a man who finished second in the NASCAR Cup Series Championship 5 times. 5 times. In 1990, in 1994, in 1998, in 2002, and in 2009 when he was 50 years old and racing with a fire that should have belonged to a man half his age. 5 times he was the second best driver in the sport. 5 times he stood on the threshold of the one achievement that the sport values above all others and watched another man walk through the door. 40 Cup Series victories, 56 career pole positions. A career that stretched from 1981 through 2013, spanning more than 3 decades of competition at the highest level. 7 Daytona 500 front row starts, 4 International Race of Champions titles, the American Speed Association Championship that announced his talent before the Cup Series had the good sense to notice. A body of work that, by every reasonable measure except the one that matters most, places Mark Martin among the greatest stock car drivers who ever lived. And no championship. Not one. Not in 31 full or partial Cup Series seasons. Not in 882 career starts. Not in the thousands of laps led, and the hundreds of top 5 finishes, and the millions of miles of racing that constituted one of the longest and most respected careers in the history of the sport. The absence of a Cup Series championship is the asterisk that appears on every assessment of Mark Martin's career. It is the fact that his critics always cite the metric by which his accomplishments are measured and found incomplete. And it is the fact that makes his story one of the most poignant and most human stories in the history of motorsport, because the failure to win the championship was not, in most cases, the result of a deficiency in talent or in effort. It was the result of circumstances, of timing, of the cruelties of a sport that distributes its highest prizes, not solely on the basis of merit, but on the basis of a complex equation that includes luck, mechanical reliability, and the specific configuration of the competitive landscape in any given year. The 1990 championship is the wound that never fully healed. Mark Martin entered the final race of that season leading the standings. He had been the best driver in the sport for most of the year. He had won races. He had accumulated points with the consistency that championships demand. And he had carried, throughout the entire season, the burden of a 46-point penalty that NASCAR had imposed early in the year for a technical infraction involving a carburetor spacer that was found to be thicker than the rules permitted. The penalty, which Martin and his team disputed, was the margin that ultimately decided the championship. Dale Earnhardt Sr. won the title by 26 points. Without the penalty, Martin would have been champion. The math is simple. The injustice, in the minds of Martin and his supporters, was profound. That season, that penalty, that 26-point margin. The championship that should have been and was not. These are the facts that haunt the Mark Martin story. The facts that transform it from a narrative of extraordinary achievement into a narrative of extraordinary heartbreak, and that make the question at the center of this documentary the most emotionally charged question in the sport's recent history. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why Mark Martin's career without a championship is more impressive than many careers with one. You are going to understand the era he competed in, the rivals he faced, the team he built with Jack Roush, and the physical and mental discipline that allowed him to compete at the highest level well into his 50s. You are going to understand the penalty that cost him the 1990 championship, the near misses that followed, and the quiet grace with which he carried a burden that would have broken lesser men. And you are going to understand why the drivers who competed against him, the men who knew his speed and his character from the inside of a cockpit, considered him one of the finest and most respected competitors the sport has ever produced. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. The 40 victories that Martin accumulated during his Cup Series career were not the victories of a driver who was merely competent or merely persistent. They were the victories of a man who was, by the assessment of the people most qualified to judge, among the 3 or 4 most talented drivers of his generation. The victories came on every type of track, from the superspeedways of Daytona and Talladega, to the short tracks of Bristol and Martinsville, to the road courses of Watkins Glen and Sonoma, to the intermediate ovals that constituted the backbone of the schedule. The breadth of the winning venues was a testament to the completeness of Martin's ability, the capacity to adapt his driving style and his competitive approach to the specific demands of each type of track. The 56 pole positions that Martin accumulated were another measure of his extraordinary ability. The pole position, awarded to the fastest qualifier, is a measure of outright speed, the ability to extract the maximum performance from the car over a single lap. Martin's pole position total placed him among the most prolific qualifiers in the sport's history and demonstrated that the craftsman, the careful strategist, the disciplined executor was also one of the fastest drivers who ever sat behind the wheel of a stock car. The combination of qualifying speed and race day consistency was one of the distinguishing characteristics of Martin's career, reflecting a comprehensive competitive ability that encompassed both the explosive single-lap speed of qualifying and the sustained, strategic performance of race day competition. The IROC Championships deserve particular emphasis in any assessment of Martin's career, because they provided a controlled test of driving ability that the Cup Series, with its inherent variations in equipment quality, could not replicate. In IROC, the cars were identical, the advantage belonged to the driver alone, and Martin, in those identical cars, was the best in the world 4 times over. The 4 IROC championships are, in some respects, the most telling statistic of Martin's career, because they isolate the one variable that matters most, the driver, and they demonstrate that Martin's ability, stripped of the equipment advantages or disadvantages that the Cup Series introduced, was superior to that of virtually every other driver in the sport. The career spanned an era of unprecedented change in the sport of stock car racing. Martin entered the Cup Series in the early 1980s, when the sport was still a predominantly southern, working-class enterprise with a modest national profile. He competed through the explosive growth of the 1990s, when television revenue and corporate sponsorship transformed the sport into a national phenomenon. He raced into the 2000s and the 2010s, adapting to the technological changes, the rule changes, and the competitive shifts that each new decade brought. The ability to maintain championship-caliber performance across such a vast span of competitive evolution was a testament to the depth of Martin's talent and the adaptability of his competitive approach. The resilience that Martin demonstrated in responding to the repeated championship disappointments was, in its own way, as impressive as the competitive performances that produced the near misses. Each disappointment was a test of character, a moment when the temptation to scale back, to accept a diminished role, to make peace with the absence of the championship, must have been powerful. Martin resisted that temptation every time, returning to competition with a freshness and a determination that suggested not a man who was gradually accepting his fate, but a man who genuinely believed each time that the next season would be the one. The belief was not naive. It was the product of an honest assessment of his own abilities and a recognition that the circumstances that had prevented the championship in previous years were not permanent features of the competitive landscape but specific, identifiable factors that could change from season to season. The penalty in 1990 was a one-time event. Gordon's 13-win season in 1998 was historically unusual. The combination of factors that produced each near-miss was different, and the reasonable expectation that different factors would produce a different outcome in the following season was the basis for Martin's continued pursuit of the championship. To understand Mark Martin, you have to understand the people who watched him race, not the corporate executives in the luxury suites or the media professionals in the press boxes. The people, the families who loaded coolers into the backs of pickup trucks and drove 3 hours to the speedway on Saturday morning. The fathers who held their sons on their shoulders so the boys could see over the fence. The mothers who kept score on the backs of programs, marking each lap with a pencil, tracking the position of the car they had adopted as their own. The working people of the American South and the American heartland who gave their weekends and their disposable income and their emotional investment to the sport of stock car racing, because the sport, at its best, reflected something true about who they were and what they valued. Stock car racing was never a rich man's sport, at least not from the grandstands. The fans who filled the seats at Daytona and Charlotte and Bristol and Talladega were drawn from the same demographic that populated the factories and the farms and the small businesses of the American interior. They were mechanics and teachers and truck drivers and nurses, people who worked with their hands and their backs, and who measured their weeks not by the meetings attended or the emails sent, but by the physical labor performed and the paychecks earned. They came to the races because the races offered something that the rest of the week did not. The spectacle of men and machines pushed to their absolute limits, the drama of competition conducted at speeds that turned every moment into a negotiation between triumph and catastrophe, and the identification with drivers who came from backgrounds that were recognizable and relatable. The drivers who connected most deeply with the fan base were the drivers who seemed like them, not the polished, corporate-friendly figures who spoke in sponsor-approved talking points and who conducted themselves with the careful calculation of men who were building brands rather than racing cars. The drivers who connected were the ones who seemed real, who spoke plainly, who worked hard, and who carried themselves with the unpretentious directness of people who had earned everything they had through effort rather than through privilege. Mark Martin was that kind of driver. He was not flashy, he was not loud. He was not the kind of personality that generates headlines through controversy or that commands attention through sheer force of charisma. He was, instead, something quieter and more durable. He was the embodiment of the values that the fan base held most dear: hard work, professionalism, respect for competitors, and the relentless pursuit of excellence conducted without complaint and without excuse. The fans who loved Martin loved him not because he was entertaining or provocative, but because he was admirable, because his career represented what they aspired to in their own lives: the steady, consistent application of talent and effort in pursuit of a goal that was always just out of reach. The cultural identity of stock car racing during the era in which Martin competed was undergoing a transformation that mirrored the broader changes in American society. The sport that had been born in the moonshine hollows of Appalachia and that had grown to maturity on the dirt tracks of the rural South was becoming a national enterprise, expanding beyond its traditional geographic and demographic base to attract audiences and sponsors from across the country. The expansion brought growth and revenue and visibility, but it also brought tension, the tension between the sport's working class, Southern identity, and the corporate, national identity that the expansion required. The 1990s, the decade in which Martin's career reached its competitive peak, were the years of the most dramatic transformation. Dale Earnhardt Sr., the Intimidator, represented the old NASCAR, the NASCAR of bumpers and beer and unapologetic Southern toughness. Jeff Gordon, the Rainbow Warrior, represented the new NASCAR, the NASCAR of corporate sponsorship and national television and carefully managed public images. The tension between the two, the cultural collision between the old guard and the new generation, was the central narrative of the decade, the storyline that drove the sport's growth and that captivated the millions of fans who lined up behind one champion or the other. Martin occupied a unique position in this cultural landscape. He was neither the old guard nor the new generation. He was the professional, the craftsman, the man who went about his business with a quiet intensity that transcended the cultural divisions and that earned the respect of both camps. He did not court controversy. He did not align himself with either faction of the sport's cultural divide. He simply raced with a consistency and a professionalism that set the standard for every other driver in the field. The fan culture that surrounded Martin was distinctive in its character. The Martin fans were not the largest or the most vocal contingent in the grandstands. They were the most loyal. They were the fans who appreciated the subtleties of the sport, who valued consistency over spectacle, who understood that the driver who finished in the top 5 every week was as impressive as the driver who won dramatically once a month. The Martin fans were connoisseurs, people who measured excellence not by the volume of the celebration, but by the depth of the commitment and the quality of the execution. The family dimension of NASCAR fandom was a significant aspect of the cultural landscape in which Martin competed. Stock car racing was, for millions of American families, a shared experience, an activity that brought parents and children together in a way that other forms of entertainment did not. The trips to the track were family events, multi-day excursions that combined the excitement of the race with the pleasures of camping, cookouts, and the kind of informal socializing that the track environment facilitated. The drivers were not just athletes, they were quasi-familial figures, men whose careers were followed with the same emotional investment that families bring to the lives of their own members. Martin's personal character made him an ideal figure for this family-oriented fan culture. He was clean, he was respectful, he did not curse in post-race interviews or engage in the kind of aggressive, confrontational behavior that some drivers embraced as part of their competitive personas. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a gentleman, a man whose conduct on and off the track reflected the values that families wanted their children to see and to emulate. The role model dimension of Martin's public persona was not calculated or performed. It was genuine, a natural expression of the character that had been shaped by his upbringing in Batesville, Arkansas, and that remained consistent throughout the decades of his career. The working-class roots of the sport were reflected not just in the demographics of the fan base, but in the economic structures that sustained the competition. The teams that competed in the Cup Series during Martin's era were, in many cases, still family-owned operations that operated on budgets that were modest by the standards of other major professional sports. The sponsorship dollars that funded the teams came from companies that sold products to working-class consumers, beer and automotive parts, and fast food and home improvement supplies, and the relationship between the sponsors and the fans was built on a shared identity, a mutual recognition that the people who bought the products and the people who watched the races were the same people. The Jack Roush partnership that defined the central years of Martin's career was itself a reflection of the sport's working-class values. Rush was an engineer, a self-made businessman, and a racing enthusiast who had built his team not through inherited wealth or corporate backing, but through the application of technical knowledge and entrepreneurial ambition. The Roush operation valued competence, effort, and results, the same values that Martin embodied as a driver, and the alignment between the team's culture and the driver's character produced a partnership that was remarkably productive and remarkably durable. The physical fitness revolution that Martin helped pioneer in NASCAR was another dimension of his contribution to the sport's culture. In an era when many drivers relied on natural ability and competitive toughness rather than on systematic physical conditioning, Martin embraced a fitness regimen that was ahead of its time, maintaining a level of physical fitness that allowed him to compete at the highest level well beyond the age at which most drivers experience significant competitive decline. The fitness commitment was not just a personal choice. It was a professional statement, a declaration that the pursuit of excellence required attention to every detail, including the physical condition of the driver, and that the willingness to invest in one's own preparation was as important as the willingness to push the car to its limits on the track. The influence of Martin's fitness example on subsequent generations of NASCAR drivers was significant. The modern Cup Series driver is expected to maintain a level of physical fitness that would have been unusual in the era before Martin demonstrated its competitive value. The training programs, the dietary regimens, the attention to physical conditioning that are now standard in the Cup Series garage can be traced, in part, to the example that Martin set through decades of demonstrating that a fit driver is a better driver. The cultural significance of Martin's career extended beyond the specific competitive achievements and the specific cultural contributions that have been described. Martin represented something more fundamental, something that the fans recognized, even if they could not always articulate it. He represented the possibility of excellence without excess, of greatness without grandiosity, of a career conducted at the highest level of professional competition while maintaining the personal values and the interpersonal conduct that the fans associated with their own best selves. Martin was not just a driver they admired. He was a person they wanted to be, a model of how to pursue ambitious goals while remaining grounded, respectful, and true to the values that mattered most. The southern and rural cultural identity that the sport carried during Martin's career was not monolithic. It encompassed a range of regional traditions, local customs, and community practices that varied from track to track and from state to state. The fans at Bristol, the half-mile concrete cauldron in the Tennessee mountains, were different in temperament and tradition from the fans at Daytona, the massive Florida superspeedway that hosted the sport's most prestigious event. The fans at Martinsville, the half-mile flat oval in southern Virginia, brought a different energy than the fans at Talladega, the enormous Alabama superspeedway, where the racing was fastest and the crowds were loudest. The diversity within the fan base was a strength, creating a competitive landscape that offered different experiences at different venues and that attracted fans with different preferences and different traditions. Martin competed at all of these venues, adapting not just his driving style, but his relationship with the fans and the communities to the specific character of each track. His consistency across the full range of venues was another dimension of his professionalism, a reflection of the respect he held for every community that hosted a race and for every fan who made the effort to attend. The merchandise culture that surrounded NASCAR during Martin's era was another expression of the sport's cultural identity. The fans expressed their loyalties through the purchase of merchandise, die-cast cars and t-shirts and hats and flags that bore the names and the numbers and the colors of their favorite drivers. The merchandise was not just commercial product. It was cultural artifact, a tangible expression of the bond between fan and driver that was worn and displayed with pride, and that served as a signal of identity and allegiance within the racing community. Martin's merchandise sales reflected his steady, loyal fan base, a community of supporters who purchased his products not because of a single dramatic moment or a sudden surge of popularity, but because of a sustained, years-long relationship built on consistent performance and consistent character. The sales were never the highest in the sport, just as Martin's victories were never the most numerous, and his personality was never the most attention-grabbing. But the sales were durable, maintained over decades rather than peaking and declining with the volatile rhythms of celebrity, and the durability was itself a reflection of the quality of the relationship between Martin and his fans. The community of Batesville, Arkansas, where Martin grew up and where he maintained his home throughout his career, was the geographic anchor of his personal and professional life. Batesville was a small city in the northeastern part of the state, far removed from the Charlotte, North Carolina, epicenter of the NASCAR world. Martin's decision to maintain his base in Arkansas rather than relocating to the Charlotte area, where most of the sports teams and drivers were concentrated, was a reflection of his values, his connection to the community that had raised him, and his conviction that the quality of a person's life is not determined by proximity to the centers of commercial activity, but by the quality of the relationships and the community that sustain that life. The cultural identity of stock car racing was, and remains, a complex and evolving phenomenon that encompasses the sport's history, its geography, its economics, and the values of the people who participate in it as competitors, as supporters, and as fans. Mark Martin's career was woven into this cultural fabric in ways that were subtle but significant, reflecting the values of the culture while also contributing to their evolution. His professionalism, his fitness commitment, his consistent character, and his quiet grace in the face of repeated disappointment were contributions to the sports culture that extended beyond the competitive results, and that continue to influence the way the sport understands and presents itself. The evolution of the fan experience at NASCAR events during Martin's career reflected the broader transformation of the sport from a regional pastime to a national entertainment enterprise. In the early years, the fan experience was simple and intimate, with spectators purchasing general admission tickets and finding their own seats in the grandstands, bringing their own food and drink, and creating their own entertainment in the hours before the race. The atmosphere was informal, unpretentious, and characterized by the direct, unmediated connection between the fans and the drivers that small, accessible venues facilitated. As the sport grew, the fan experience became more structured, more expensive, and more commercialized. The addition of luxury suites, VIP experiences, and corporate hospitality areas transformed the trackside environment from a democratic, equal access space into a stratified hierarchy of experiences that reflected the economic realities of a sport that was generating billions of dollars in annual revenue. The transformation brought improvements in comfort and amenities, but also introduced a distance between the fans and the drivers that the earlier era had not known. Martin's relationship with the fans was maintained across this transformation, adapting to the changing environment while preserving the personal quality that had always characterized his interactions with the public. He signed autographs with a patience and a graciousness that reflected his genuine appreciation for the people who supported his career. He participated in fan events and promotional activities with a professionalism that reflected his understanding of the obligations that public visibility created, and he treated every fan interaction as an opportunity to represent the values of respect and decency that the fan base associated with his character. The regional diversity of the fan base was a source of richness that contributed to the sport's cultural vitality. The fans at the tracks in the traditional southern markets, Charlotte and Darlington and Bristol and Talladega, brought a deep familiarity with the sport's history and a passionate engagement with its competitive narratives. The fans at the newer tracks in the non-traditional markets, Las Vegas and Kansas and California, brought a freshness and an enthusiasm that reflected the excitement of discovery, the pleasure of encountering a sport that was new to them, and that offered a form of entertainment that was different from anything they had previously experienced. Martin competed at all of these venues, old and new, southern and non-southern, traditional and emerging, and his popularity at each reflected the universality of the qualities that made him admirable: the hard work, the professionalism, the respect for competitors, the quiet determination. These were not southern values or northern values. They were human values, recognized and appreciated by fans of every background and every region. The television coverage that accompanied the sport's growth during Martin's career created a new dimension of the fan experience that was both an expansion and a transformation. The ability to watch every race on television, to follow the championship battle in real time from the comfort of one's living room, democratized access to the sport and expanded the audience far beyond the capacity of any individual track. But the television experience was also a mediated experience, filtered through the commentary of broadcasters and the editorial decisions of producers, and the intimacy of the live experience, the visceral sensation of the engines and the speed and the proximity to the competition was necessarily lost in the translation from track to screen. Martin's television persona was consistent with his in-person character, professional, measured, and occasionally dryly humorous. He was not the most electrifying interview in the Cup Series garage, but he was among the most honest and the most thoughtful, providing the kind of substantive, insightful commentary that the more careful members of the media appreciated. The television persona contributed to the overall impression of Martin as a man of substance, a competitor whose value lay not in his entertainment potential, but in the depth of his competitive commitment and the quality of his character. The sponsor relationships that supported Martin's career throughout its decades of competition were themselves a reflection of the cultural dynamics that have been described. The sponsors who aligned themselves with Martin, companies like Folgers, Valvoline, Pfizer, and others, chose to associate their brands with a driver whose public image was professional, respectable, and family-friendly, qualities that the sponsors valued because they aligned with the demographics and the values of the consumers they were trying to reach. The Viagra sponsorship that adorned Martin's car during the later years of his career was one of the more memorable and more discussed sponsorship relationships in the sport's history. notable for the good humor with which Martin handled the inevitable jokes and commentary that the sponsorship generated. The relationship was a commercial success, providing the team with the financial resources to compete at a high level while also demonstrating that Martin's professional persona was resilient enough to manage even the most potentially awkward commercial association with grace and humor. The economic contribution that Martin made to the Rush Racing organization over the course of their nearly two-decade partnership was substantial. Martin's competitive results attracted sponsors, generated revenue, and provided the foundation on which the Rush organization was able to grow and to expand. The team's evolution from a single-car operation to a multi-car powerhouse was facilitated, in significant part, by the competitive success and the commercial value that Martin's driving produced. The partnership was a symbiosis, with Rush providing the equipment and the organizational support that Martin's talent required, and Martin providing the competitive results and the commercial value that the organization needed to sustain itself and to grow. The cultural significance of Martin's career in the context of the sport's broader history extends to the influence he exerted on the definition of what a NASCAR driver should be. Before Martin, the archetypal NASCAR driver was a rough-hewn, physically imposing figure whose character was defined by toughness, aggression, and the willingness to use the car as a weapon in pursuit of victory. Martin offered a different archetype, a driver whose character was defined by precision, discipline, and the pursuit of excellence through preparation and consistency, rather than through confrontation and intimidation. The Martin archetype did not replace the traditional archetype. Both continue to coexist in the sports culture, and both continue to be valued by different segments of the fans base. But Martin's example expanded the definition of what a NASCAR driver could be, creating space for drivers whose competitive strengths lay in the quieter, more disciplined dimensions of the craft rather than in the louder, more confrontational dimensions. The expansion was a contribution to the sport's cultural diversity, enlarging the tent of competitive approaches and personal styles that the sport recognized and celebrated. The importance of the ASA Championship years as a foundation for Martin's Cup Series career cannot be overstated. The ASA was the crucible where Martin's professional skills were forged, the environment where his driving technique, his competitive strategy, and his work ethic were developed and refined. The ASA Championship was not just a developmental milestone. It was a statement of competence and of ambition, a declaration that the young man from Batesville was ready for the national stage, and that the talent he had demonstrated on the regional circuit was genuine and transferable. The competitors who raced against Martin in the ASA, many of whom went on to careers in the Cup Series and other national series, have spoken about his abilities with a respect that echoes the assessments of his Cup Series peers. The ASA community recognized Martin's talent as something special, something that went beyond the normal range of competitive ability, and the recognition was offered with the same unanimity and the same conviction that would later characterize the Cup Series community's assessment of his career. The tradition of tailgating and camping at NASCAR events was one of the most distinctive features of the fan culture during Martin's era. At tracks across the country, the parking lots and the camping areas surrounding the speedways would fill with fans who arrived days before the race, setting up elaborate camping setups with grills, tents, flags, and the merchandise of their favorite drivers. The pre-race atmosphere was a festival, a celebration of the community that the sport created and of the shared passion that brought the fans together. The community dimension of the fan experience was particularly significant for a sport that drew its audience from across a wide geographic area. The fans who gathered at the tracks came from different states, different cities, different backgrounds, but they were united by their love of the sport and by the allegiances they formed with their favorite drivers and teams. The friendships that were formed in the campgrounds and the grandstands, friendships that sometimes lasted for decades, were a testament to the power of shared passion to create community across the barriers of geography and social circumstance. Martin's fans were part of this community, contributing their own traditions and their own energy to the collective experience. The number 6 that adorned Martin's car became a symbol of the values that his fans shared: the commitment to excellence, the respect for competition, and the quiet determination that characterized both the driver and the community that supported him. The merchandise, the flags, the hats, the die-cast cars, all of these were expressions of the bond between Martin and his fans, tangible artifacts of a relationship that was built not on flash or spectacle, but on the deeper foundations of shared values and mutual respect. The role of radio broadcasting in connecting the fan base to the sport during Martin's era was another significant cultural dimension. The Motor Racing Network, MRN, and the Performance Racing Network, PRN, provided radio coverage of Cup Series races that was available to fans who could not attend the events in person. The radio broadcasts, with their vivid descriptions of the racing action and their intimate commentary from pit road and the broadcast booth, created a connection between the fan at home and the competition at the track that was, in some ways, more immediate and more personal than the television coverage that would eventually supplement and largely replace it. The evolution of race day scheduling during Martin's career reflected the changing demographics and consumption habits of the fan base. The traditional Sunday afternoon race schedule, which had been the standard for decades, was supplemented by Saturday night races that attracted different audiences and that created a different atmosphere at the tracks. The night races, conducted under the lights at tracks like Bristol, Richmond, and Charlotte, produced some of the most exciting and most visually spectacular events on the schedule, and Martin's performances in these events were consistently strong, demonstrating his ability to adapt to the different conditions that night racing created. The transition from the Winston Cup era to the Nextel Cup, and eventually the Sprint Cup era during Martin's career, reflected the changing sponsorship landscape of the sport. The departure of R.J. Reynolds as the series title sponsor and the arrival of Nextel and later Sprint marked a shift in the commercial identity of the sport that accompanied its broader cultural transformation. The title sponsorship changes were more than cosmetic. They reflected the evolution of the sport's commercial partnerships and the changing demographics of its audience, as the tobacco-associated identity of the Winston Cup era gave way to the technology-associated identity of the telecommunications era. Martin navigated these transitions with the same professionalism that characterized every other aspect of his career. He adapted to the changing sponsorship landscape, to the changing media environment, and to the changing competitive dynamics with a consistency and a grace that reflected the depth of his professional commitment and the breadth of his adaptability. The ability to remain relevant and competitive through multiple generations of the sport's evolution was one of the most impressive aspects of his career, reflecting a versatility and a durability that few other drivers have matched. The prayer that preceded many NASCAR events during Martin's era was another expression of the cultural identity that defined the sport's relationship with its audience. The pre-race invocation, typically delivered by a local minister or chaplain, was a tradition that reflected the religious faith that was an important part of the cultural fabric of the sport's core audience. The invocation was not universally appreciated, and its continued presence in the pre-race program was a source of debate about the appropriate role of religious expression in a public sporting event. But for the fans who valued it, the invocation was a meaningful moment, a recognition of the spiritual dimension of a community that took its faith seriously, and that appreciated having that faith acknowledged in the public square. Martin's personal relationship with faith was a private matter, consistent with his broader approach to the boundaries between public and private life. He did not make public declarations about his religious beliefs or use his public platform to promote any particular spiritual perspective. The reticence was characteristic of his approach to all personal matters, a reflection of the conviction that certain aspects of a person's life are appropriately kept private, and that the public's curiosity does not constitute a claim on the individual's personal domain. The pre-race driver introductions, which became increasingly elaborate during the course of Martin's career, were another dimension of the fan experience that reflected the sport's evolving cultural identity. In the early years, The introductions were simple and functional, a public address announcement of each driver's name and car number as the field prepared for the race. By the later years, the introductions had become theatrical events, complete with pyrotechnics, music, and video presentations that transformed the pre-race period into an entertainment spectacle. Martin's response to the evolving pageantry of the pre-race introductions was characteristic of his overall approach to the sport's cultural evolution: acceptance without complaint, participation without enthusiasm, and a quiet preference for the substance of the competition over the spectacle that surrounded it. He understood that the pageantry was part of the sport's commercial appeal, and that the fans enjoyed it, and he participated with the professionalism that defined every other aspect of his public conduct. But the racing was always the point, and Martin's focus on the competition rather than the spectacle was one of the qualities that his most devoted fans valued most. The working-class identity of the NASCAR fanbase underwent significant changes during the later years of Martin's career, as the sport's expanding audience brought new demographics and new economic strata to the grandstands. The addition of tracks in non-traditional markets, the growth of the sport's television audience beyond its traditional southern base, and the increasing involvement of national corporate sponsors all contributed to a broadening of the fan base that diluted, to some degree, the working-class cultural identity that had defined the sport for decades. The broadening was both an opportunity and a challenge. It expanded the sport's commercial base and its cultural relevance, providing the revenue and the audience that sustained its growth. But it also introduced tensions between the sport's traditional identity and its evolving national profile, tensions that were felt by fans who valued the sport's working-class roots and who worried that the growth was coming at the expense of the authenticity and the accessibility that had made the sport special. Martin's career spanned this broadening, and his character resonated with fans on both sides of the cultural divide. The traditional fans valued his working-class origins, his quiet demeanor, and his unpretentious professionalism. The newer fans valued his competitive excellence, his fitness commitment, and his ability to perform at a high level across multiple decades. The dual appeal was a reflection of the universality of the values that Martin embodied, values that transcended the cultural divisions within the fan base, and that spoke to the common human appreciation of effort, character, and the dignified pursuit of excellence. The importance of the hauler, the massive 18-wheel transporter that carried the team's equipment from track to track in the logistics of Cup Series competition, was a largely invisible but essential element of the competitive enterprise. The hauler was the team's mobile workshop, carrying the race car, the spare parts, the tools, and the support equipment that the team needed to compete at each event. The hauler also served as the team's hospitality center, providing a space where sponsors, guests, and media could interact with the team's personnel in a controlled, professional environment. Martin's hauler, adorned with the livery of his sponsors and the number 6 that was his competitive identifier, was one of many in the paddock area, part of the rolling city that NASCAR assembled and disassembled at each track on the schedule. The pit road culture that developed during Martin's era was another dimension of the competitive environment that reflected the sport's evolving professionalism. The pit crews, which had once been composed of the team's mechanics who doubled as tire changers and jack operators during the race, evolved into specialized units of trained athletes whose sole responsibility was the execution of the pit stop. The evolution of the pit crew was driven by the recognition that the time saved on pit road could translate directly into track position, and that the investment in dedicated pit crew personnel was a competitive advantage that justified the expense. The Martin team's pit stops were consistently among the best in the field, reflecting the same emphasis on preparation and execution that characterized every other aspect of the team's operations. The seconds saved on each pit stop were the product of hours of practice and preparation, the same kind of disciplined, systematic approach that Martin brought to his driving and that Roush brought to the team's engineering. Mark Anthony Martin was born on January 9, 1959, in Batesville, Arkansas, a small city of fewer than 10,000 people nestled in the Ozark foothills of the northeastern part of the state. The community was defined by the rhythms of rural American life, farming and small business and church on Sunday, and the quiet, unspectacular decency of people who knew their neighbors and who measured their lives by the quality of their relationships rather than the size of their accomplishments. It was not, by any obvious measure, the kind of place that produced professional race car drivers, but it produced one, and the character of the place, the values it instilled, the expectations it set, shaped everything that Mark Martin became. Martin's introduction to racing came through his father, Julian Martin, who was a competitive racer on the local dirt tracks of the Arkansas region. The father's involvement in the sport was Martin's entry point, the door through which the young boy from Batesville walked into a world that would consume the next 4 decades of his life. The exposure to racing was early and total. Martin was at the tracks as a child, absorbing the sights and the sounds and the culture of the sport, developing the instincts and the knowledge that would later form the foundation of a professional career. He began competing himself as a teenager, racing on the local dirt tracks and short tracks of Arkansas and the surrounding states. The talent was evident from the earliest stages. Martin was fast, aggressive, and possessed of a competitive intensity that was disproportionate to his age and his experience. He won races, he won championships. He established himself within the regional racing community as a young driver of extraordinary promise, a kid from Batesville who had the speed and the determination to compete at levels far above the local scene. The American Speed Association, known as ASA, was the proving ground where Martin's talent was first tested against competition that approached the quality of the national series. The ASA was a Midwestern-based racing organization that served as a developmental league for aspiring Cup Series drivers, attracting a mix of established short-track champions and up-and-coming young talents who were seeking to make the transition to the national stage. Martin competed in the ASA beginning in the late 1970s and quickly established himself as one of the series' most dominant competitors. He won the ASA championship multiple times, producing a run of dominance that made his eventual promotion to the Cup Series seem not just likely, but inevitable. The ASA years was significant not just for the competitive results they produced, but for the driving style and the competitive approach that Martin developed during them. The ASA tracks were short ovals that rewarded patience, car conservation, and the ability to manage traffic on narrow racing surfaces. Martin learned to race with a precision and a discipline that were unusual for a young driver, developing the strategic intelligence that would later make him one of the most consistently competitive drivers in the Cup Series. The ASA was his university, the place where the raw talent that Batesville had produced was refined into the professional competence that the national stage demanded. The early Cup Series years were difficult. Martin made his Cup debut in 1981 and competed in a limited number of races over the next several seasons, producing results that were modest and that reflected the limitations of the equipment and the organizational support available to him. The transition from the ASA to the Cup Series was not smooth, and the gap between the resources available to an ASA champion and the resources required to compete at the Cup level was a constant source of frustration. And the truth gets heavier when you consider the personal struggles that Martin endured during the early years of his Cup career. Martin has spoken publicly about the period of his life in which he struggled with the use of alcohol and the impact it had on his personal life and his racing career. The struggle was real, and it represented a crisis that threatened to derail the promising career that his talent had made possible. The acknowledgement of this struggle, offered with the honesty and the directness that characterized Martin's public statements throughout his career, was an act of courage that earned him the respect of the racing community, and that demonstrated the depth of the character that lay beneath the competitive exterior. The recovery from the personal crisis was a turning point that transformed Martin's career and his life. He addressed the issue with the same determination and the same discipline that he brought to his racing, committing to sobriety and to the physical and mental fitness regimen that would become one of the defining characteristics of his professional life. The recovery was not just a personal achievement. It was the foundation on which the rest of his career was built, the decision that made everything that followed possible. The partnership with Jack Roush, which began in 1988, was the catalytic event that transformed Martin from a talented driver with limited resources into a championship contender with the equipment and the organizational support to compete at the highest level. Roush, a successful businessman and racing enthusiast, was building a Cup Series team that reflected his engineering-first philosophy, an operation that valued technical analysis, systematic preparation, and the relentless pursuit of competitive advantage through engineering excellence. The alignment between Roush's analytical approach and Martin's disciplined driving style was natural and productive. Martin was not a driver who relied on raw aggression or on the kind of instinctive, feel-based driving that some of his competitors employed. He was a thinking driver, a man who approached each race with a plan, and who executed that plan with a precision that reflected hours of preparation and analysis. The Roush team provided the infrastructure that this approach required, the engineering talent, the data analysis capabilities, and the organizational discipline that translated Martin's talent into results. The partnership produced results almost immediately. In 1989, Martin's second full season with Roush, he won his first Cup Series race at Rockingham, North Carolina, and finished third in the championship standings. The breakthrough season announced that the partnership was competitive and that Martin, given the right equipment and the right organizational support, was capable of challenging for the sport's highest prizes. The 1990 season was the year that everything came together and then fell apart. Martin entered the season as one of the favourites for the championship, driving the number 6, Folgers Ford, with a confidence and a competitiveness that reflected the growing strength of the Roush operation. He won 3 races that year and accumulated points with a consistency that placed him at or near the top of the standings throughout the season. But the season was shadowed from its earliest stages by the penalty that NASCAR had imposed for a technical infraction discovered during the post-race inspection at Richmond International Raceway. The infraction involved a carburetor spacer that was found to be thicker than the specifications allowed. The team maintained that the spacer was within tolerances and that the infraction, if it existed at all, was inadvertent and of negligible competitive significance. NASCAR disagreed, imposing a penalty of 46 points that was applied to Martin's championship total, 46 points. In a championship that would ultimately be decided by a margin of 26, the 46-point penalty was the difference between a championship and a runner-up finish. Dale Earnhardt Sr., the Intimidator, won the 1990 championship by 26 points over Martin. Without the penalty, Martin would have won by 20 points. The math was brutal in its simplicity. The penalty cost Martin the championship. The controversy surrounding the penalty has been debated for more than 3 decades, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. Martin supporters argue that the penalty was disproportionate to the infraction, that the carburetor spacer issue was a minor technical matter that should not have carried a championship-altering penalty, and that the enforcement was inconsistent with the way similar infractions had been handled in other cases. The counter-argument is that the rules are the rules, that compliance is the responsibility of the team, and that the penalty, however harsh, was applied in accordance with the regulations. The fairness of the penalty is, ultimately, a matter of perspective. What is not a matter of perspective is the impact that the penalty had on Mark Martin and on the trajectory of his career. The 1990 championship was the closest Martin would come to winning the title during the prime of his competitive years, and the loss of that championship, under the circumstances that have been described, cast a shadow over everything that followed. The penalty did not just cost Martin a championship. It established a narrative, a storyline of heartbreak and near misses that would define his career for the next 2 decades. The 1994 championship campaign was the second major near miss. Martin won 2 races and finished second in the standings behind Dale Earnhardt Sr., who won his 7th and final championship that year. The margin was larger than in 1990, but the frustration was similar. The feeling of being close but not close enough, of being among the best but not the best, of doing everything within your power and still falling short. The 1998 season produced another championship heartbreak. Martin won 7 races, the highest single-season total of his career, and finished second in the standings behind Jeff Gordon, who won 13 races that year in one of the most dominant single-season performances in the sport's history. The 7 victories were a career achievement for Martin, but they were not enough to overcome the historic dominance of Gordon's season, and the championship slipped away again. The 2002 season was yet another second-place finish, this time behind Tony Stewart. Martin won once that year, but accumulated points with the consistency that had been the hallmark of his championship campaigns, finishing close enough to contend, but not close enough to win. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. Each near-miss was endured with a grace and a dignity that elevated Martin's reputation even as the championship continued to elude him. He did not complain. He did not make excuses. He did not blame the cars, the team, the other drivers, or the rules. He accepted the results with the quiet professionalism that defined his character, acknowledged the achievements of the drivers who had beaten him, and returned the following season with the same determination and the same commitment to excellence that had characterized every season of his career. The grace under pressure was not an act. It was the genuine expression of a character that had been shaped by the values of Batesville, Arkansas, by the recovery from personal crisis, and by the conviction that a man's worth is measured not by the trophies on his shelf, but by the quality of his effort and the dignity of his conduct. Martin believed this, he lived it, and the consistency with which he embodied these values. Through decades of competition and through repeated disappointments that would have embittered lesser men, was the most impressive achievement of his career. The driving style that Martin brought to the Cup Series was a reflection of the man himself, precise, disciplined, and extraordinarily consistent. Martin was not the most aggressive driver in the field. He was not the kind of competitor who routinely bumped and banged his way through the pack, using the car as a weapon to intimidate and to dominate. He was a craftsman, a man who drove with a smoothness and a precision that reflected years of careful development and that produced results through efficiency rather than through force. The smoothness was not softness. Martin could be aggressive when the situation demanded it, pushing his car to the absolute limits of its capability in the closing laps of a race when the victory was within reach. But the aggression was always controlled, always purposeful, always in service of the larger competitive objective. He did not waste speed or risk unnecessary damage to his equipment in the early stages of a race. He conserved, planned, and executed, producing the kind of sustained, consistent performance that championship campaigns require. The physical fitness that Martin maintained throughout his career was a competitive advantage that complemented his driving skills. Martin was, by all accounts, one of the fittest drivers in the Cup Series field, maintaining a training regimen that included weight training, cardiovascular conditioning, and nutritional discipline that was ahead of its time. The fitness allowed him to maintain his concentration and his physical performance throughout the grueling 4-hour races that the Cup schedule demanded, and it was one of the factors that enabled him to compete at a high level well into his 50s, an age at which most drivers have long since retired. The relationship between fitness and longevity was one of the most important aspects of Martin's legacy. The conventional wisdom in the sport held that drivers peaked in their 30s and declined significantly in their 40s, with the physical demands of the competition eventually exceeding the capabilities of the aging body. Martin challenged this wisdom, demonstrating, through his own example, that a driver who invested in his physical conditioning could maintain competitive performance well beyond the age at which conventional wisdom expected decline. The Rouge partnership endured for nearly 2 decades, from 1988 through 2006, producing 40 of Martin's 40 Cup Series victories and establishing both men as pillars of the Cup Series community. The longevity of the partnership was itself a remarkable achievement, reflecting the depth of the personal and professional bond between the two men and the compatibility of their competitive philosophies. Martin's loyalty to Roush, maintained through seasons of championship contention and seasons of relative disappointment, was one of the defining characteristics of the partnership and one of the most admired aspects of Martin's character. The decision to leave Roush after the 2006 season, after nearly 2 decades of partnership, was one of the most emotional moments of Martin's career. The departure was driven by competitive considerations, the recognition that the Roush organization was experiencing a decline in competitiveness that was affecting Martin's ability to contend for championships. The decision was painful for both men, a rupture of a professional relationship that had been one of the most productive and most enduring in the sport's history. The post-Roush years, which included stints with Hendrick Motorsports, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, Ginn Racing, and Michael Waltrip Racing, extended Martin's career into his 50s and produced the remarkable 2009 season that would become the final chapter of his championship story. The Roush racing operation that Martin joined in 1988 was an organization that was still in the early stages of its development as a Cup Series competitor. Jack Roush had been successful in other forms of racing, including sports car racing and drag racing, before entering the Cup Series, and he brought to the endeavour an engineering-first philosophy that was different from the trial-and-error approach that many of the sport's established teams employed. Roush believed that the systematic application of engineering principles, data analysis, and continuous improvement methodologies could produce competitive advantages that would translate into results on the track. The philosophy was vindicated by the results that the Martin partnership produced. The team's performance improved steadily from the late 1980s through the 1990s, with the victories becoming more frequent and the championship contention becoming more sustained. The growth reflected the combined contributions of Martin's driving talent and Roush's organizational vision, each man amplifying the other's strengths in a partnership that was greater than the sum of its parts. The relationship between Martin and Roush was characterized by a mutual respect and a shared commitment to excellence that endured through nearly 2 decades of competition. The two men were different in temperament and in approach. Roush was analytical, detail-oriented, and sometimes demanding in his expectations. Martin was disciplined, professional, and quietly determined. The differences were complementary rather than conflicting, producing a working relationship that was productive and durable. The crew chief relationships that Martin maintained during the Roush years were another dimension of the partnership's success. Steve Meal, Jimmy Fenig, and other crew chiefs who worked with Martin during his time at Roush have spoken about the quality of his feedback, the precision of his descriptions of the car's behavior, and the collaborative approach he brought to the process of making the car faster. Martin was not a driver who expected the crew chief to solve every problem. He was a partner in the process, contributing his observations and his insights to the collective effort of optimizing the team's performance. The development of the Roush racing operation from a single-car team into a multi-car organization was facilitated, in significant part, by the competitive success and the commercial value that Martin's driving produced. The sponsors who invested in the team's number 6 car were attracted by the combination of Martin's competitive results and his professional image, and the revenue they provided allowed Roush to invest in the expansion of the organization, adding additional cars and additional personnel that increased the team's competitive capabilities and its commercial value. The addition of other drivers to the Roush operation, including Jeff Burton, Matt Kenseth, Kurt Busch, and Greg Biffle, created a multi-car team that was among the most competitive in the sport. Martin served as the senior driver of this expanding roster, providing leadership and example to the younger drivers who joined the team and who benefited from the culture of professionalism and competitive discipline that Martin had helped establish. The mentoring role that Martin played within the Roush organization was another dimension of his contribution that extended beyond his own competitive results. The younger drivers who joined the team looked to Martin as a model of how to conduct a professional racing career, and the influence of his example was visible in the conduct and the character of the drivers who benefited from it. Matt Kenseth, who won the Cup Championship in 2003 while driving for Roush, has acknowledged the influence that Martin's example had on his approach to competition and to his public life. The 1993 season was a particularly notable one for Martin, as he won 5 races and finished third in the championship standings, demonstrating the continued strength of the Roush partnership and the consistency of Martin's performance. The season was one of several during the mid-1990s in which Martin produced results that placed him among the top competitors in the sport without quite reaching the championship level. The 1997 season was another strong year, with Martin winning 4 races and finishing in the top 5 of the championship standings. The consistency of the top 5 championship finishes during the 1990s was a testament to the sustained quality of Martin's performance and to the depth of the Roush organization's competitive capabilities. The annual championship contention, even in years when the title was not within reach, demonstrated that Martin and the Roush team were always among the best in the sport. The 2000 season brought a significant rule change that affected the competitive dynamics of the Cup Series. The introduction of new aerodynamic regulations altered the performance characteristics of the cars and required the teams to adapt their engineering approaches and their setup philosophies. Martin and the Roush team adapted to the changes with characteristic thoroughness, producing results that maintained their position among the sport's elite organizations. The competitive challenges that Martin faced during the later years of the Roush partnership included not just the evolution of the competitive landscape, but also the emergence of team structures and resource levels that exceeded what the Roush organization could match. The Hendrick Motorsports operation, which fielded 4 Cup Series cars with budgets and engineering resources that were among the largest in the sport, established a competitive standard that single-car or 2-car operations struggled to match. The gap between the mega-teams and the smaller operations was a recurring challenge for Martin and for Roush, a competitive disadvantage that skill and determination could sometimes overcome, but that constituted a persistent headwind against which the partnership had to compete. The emotional dimension of the Roush partnership was one of the least visible but most significant aspects of the relationship. Martin has spoken about the loyalty he felt toward Roush, the gratitude for the opportunity that Roush had provided, and the personal bond that had developed over nearly 2 decades of shared competition. The decision to leave Roush after the 2006 season was, by Martin's own account, one of the most difficult decisions of his career, a choice that was driven by competitive necessity, but that carried an emotional cost that the competitive calculus could not fully capture. The transition to Hendrick Motorsports for the 2009 season was a strategic move that placed Martin in the most successful organization in the sport's history. The Hendrick team, which had won multiple championships with Jeff Gordon and Jimmie Johnson, provided the equipment, the engineering resources, and the organizational support that Martin's talent deserved, and that the declining competitiveness of the Roush operation could no longer provide. The 2009 season was the validation of the move and the final, glorious chapter of Martin's championship story. Driving the number 5 Hendrick Chevrolet, Martin produced a season that defied every expectation about the relationship between age and competitive performance. 5 victories, a top 5 finish in the championship standings that became, by the end of the season, a championship contention that placed him second behind Jimmie Johnson in the final chase standings. The 5-win season at the age of 50 was a performance that transcended the specific context of stock car racing, and that spoke to the broader human capacity for sustained excellence. The athletic world is accustomed to the narrative of decline, the assumption that physical capabilities diminish with age, and that the athletes who perform at the highest levels in their 20s and 30s will inevitably decline in their 40s and beyond. Martin's 2009 season challenged this narrative in the most dramatic way possible, producing championship-caliber results at an age when most drivers have long since retired. The key to the performance was the physical fitness regimen that Martin had maintained throughout his career. The training, the nutrition, the attention to recovery, the disciplined management of the body's physical resources. All of these factors combined to produce a 50-year-old man whose physical capabilities were, by the standards of his profession, still elite. The fitness was not a guarantee of competitive success. Speed, reflexes, and car feel are partly age-dependent and partly fitness-dependent, and the relationship between the two is complex. But the fitness provided Martin with a physical platform that was sufficient to support the driving talent that had been his greatest asset for 3 decades. The chase format that governed the 2009 championship added drama and unpredictability to the championship battle in a way that the old full-season points system had not. The chase, which reset the championship standings with 10 races remaining and created a playoff-like competition among the top qualifiers, rewarded late-season performance and created the possibility of dramatic comebacks and collapses that the full-season system had rarely produced. Martin entered the 2009 chase as a legitimate contender and maintained his championship bid through the closing races, producing a narrative of competitive resilience that captivated the sport and the broader sporting public. The final race of the 2009 chase at Homestead Miami Speedway was the last act of Martin's championship story. He entered the race with a mathematical chance to win the title, but the gap to the leader, Jimmie Johnson, was significant enough that the championship was effectively decided before the race began. Martin competed with his characteristic effort and professionalism, but the championship was Johnson's, the 4th of his 5 consecutive titles, and Martin's 5th runner-up finish was confirmed as the final standings were calculated. The emotional response to the 5th runner-up finish was, by Martin's own account, the most difficult of the 5. The previous near-misses had been painful, but each one had been accompanied by the expectation that another opportunity would present itself. The 2009 season, at the age of 50, carried with it the awareness that the opportunities were running out, that the physical capabilities that had sustained his competitiveness for 3 decades could not be sustained indefinitely, and that the championship, if it did not come this time, might never come at all. The awareness was correct. The 2009 season was Martin's last championship contention. The subsequent seasons, from 2010 through 2013, were characterized by a gradual transition from championship-level competition to a more limited role that reflected the natural progression of an aging career. The victories did not come. The consistent top 5 finishes became less frequent, and the championship aspirations that had animated Martin's career for more than 2 decades were replaced by a more modest set of goals to compete professionally, to represent his sponsors and his team with the dignity that had always characterized his approach, and to conclude his career on his own terms. The early career setbacks that Martin endured before the Roush partnership provided the foundation of character and resilience that would serve him through the championship near-misses that followed. The years of racing with limited resources, of competing against better-funded teams with inferior equipment, taught Martin the value of preparation and efficiency, the ability to extract maximum performance from whatever was available, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that might never arrive. The personal crisis involving alcohol that Martin addressed early in his career was a crucible that shaped the man who emerged from it. The decision to confront the problem, to seek help, and to commit to sobriety was an act of courage that required the same determination and discipline that championship racing demands. Martin has spoken about the experience with a candor that reflects his belief in the value of honesty and in the potential for personal transformation, and his willingness to discuss the subject publicly has provided encouragement and example to others who face similar challenges. The sobriety that Martin maintained for the remaining decades of his career was not passive. It was an active, daily commitment that required vigilance and discipline, particularly in an environment where the pressures of competition and the social culture of the racing world created opportunities for relapse. Martin's ability to maintain his sobriety through these pressures was a testament to the strength of his character and to the depth of his commitment to the values that guided his life. The transformation that the recovery produced was comprehensive. The driver who emerged from the personal crisis was more focused, more disciplined, and more committed to the pursuit of excellence than the driver who had entered it. The recovery did not just restore Martin to his previous level of competence. It elevated him, providing a foundation of personal discipline and self-awareness that enhanced every dimension of his professional performance. The Jack Roush partnership that began in 1988 gave Martin, for the first time in his Cup career, the organizational support and the equipment quality that his talent has deserved. The transformation in his competitive results was immediate and dramatic, with the team producing victories and championship contention from the second season of the partnership onward. The partnership was the turning point of Martin's career, the moment when the talent that had been evident since his earliest racing days was finally matched with the resources necessary to express it at the highest level. The number 6 Valvoline Ford that Martin drove during the early Rush years became one of the most recognizable cars in the Cup Series field. Its white and blue livery, a familiar sight at the front of the pack during the races of the early 1990s. The car was more than a competitive instrument. It was a symbol, a visual representation of the values that Martin and the Roush team embodied: professionalism, consistency, and the relentless pursuit of competitive excellence. The relationship between Martin and the Ford Motor Company, which supplied the engines and the manufacturer support for the Roush operation, was another dimension of the partnership that contributed to the team's competitiveness. Ford's factory racing program provided the team with access to the latest engine technology, aerodynamic research, and technical support, resources that complemented the team's own engineering capabilities, and that enhanced its ability to compete with the Chevrolet-backed teams that constituted much of the competitive field. The Folgers sponsorship that preceded the Valvoline sponsorship on Martin's car was one of the early commercial partnerships that supported the Roush operation, providing the financial resources that allowed the team to invest in the equipment and the personnel necessary to compete at the championship level. The transition from Folgers to Valvoline and subsequently to other sponsors reflected the evolving commercial landscape of the sport and the team's ability to attract corporate partners whose investment was justified by the competitive results and the professional image that Martin provided. The 1991 season, Martin's first full season after the devastating 1990 championship loss, was a test of his psychological resilience and his competitive determination. Martin responded to the disappointment with a performance that demonstrated his ability to process defeat and to return to competition with renewed purpose. He won one race that year and finished in the championship's top 10, maintaining the competitive standard that the Roush team had established and demonstrating that the 1990 loss had not diminished his competitive capabilities or his motivation. The subsequent seasons of the early and mid-1990s were characterized by a consistency that was both impressive and, for Martin supporters, frustrating. The team was always competitive, always in the championship conversation, always producing the kind of results that placed Martin among the best in the sport. But the championship, the one achievement that would have elevated the career from excellent to legendary in the public estimation, continued to elude him, slipping away in the closing weeks of one season after another. The persistence in the face of this repeated frustration was the quality that most distinguished Martin's career from those of other talented drivers who failed to win the championship. Many drivers who came close to the title and failed eventually accepted the disappointment and scaled back their ambitions, settling for a comfortable role as a competitive also-ran, rather than continuing to expose themselves to the pain of repeated near misses. Martin never settled, he never accepted. He returned to every season with the full expectation that this would be the year, and the unwillingness to compromise that expectation was the defining characteristic of his competitive character. The physical training regimen that supported Martin's competitive longevity deserves detailed examination because it represented a significant departure from the norms of the era. Martin's training program included daily weight training sessions that were designed to maintain the upper body strength necessary to manage the heavy, unassisted steering of the Cup cars. The program also included cardiovascular training, typically running or cycling, that maintained the aerobic fitness necessary to sustain concentration and physical performance through the 4-hour races that the Cup schedule demanded. The nutritional component of Martin's fitness program was equally rigorous. Martin maintained a diet that was designed to support his training, to manage his body composition, and to provide the energy and the recovery resources that the demanding competitive schedule required. The nutritional discipline was maintained year-round, not just during the racing season, reflecting Martin's conviction that the pursuit of physical excellence was a continuous process rather than a seasonal activity. The influence of Martin's fitness commitment on the broader culture of the Cup Series garage was gradual but significant. In the early years, Martin's training regimen was viewed with curiosity and sometimes with amusement by competitors, who relied on the traditional approach of natural toughness and competitive determination rather than on systematic physical conditioning. As the years passed and as Martin's continued competitiveness at ages that would have been retirement age for most drivers became impossible to ignore, the attitude shifted from curiosity to respect and eventually to emulation. The modern Cup Series drivers' training program, which typically includes weight training, cardiovascular conditioning, and nutritional management, owes a significant debt to the example that Martin set through decades of demonstrating the competitive value of physical fitness. The competitive approach that Martin brought to the Cup Series was a synthesis of the different influences that had shaped his development. The dirt track experience in Arkansas had given him the car control and the improvisational instincts that dirt racing demanded. The ASA experience had given him the strategic sophistication and the professional discipline that the national-level competition required. And the personal recovery had given him the self-awareness and the determination that sustained him through the decades of championship pursuit that followed. The synthesis was unique to Martin, a combination of skills and qualities that no other driver of his era possessed in the same proportions. Other drivers were faster in qualifying. Other drivers were more aggressive on the track. Other drivers were more charismatic in the public eye. But no other driver combined Martin's particular mix of speed, consistency, professionalism, and character, and the combination, while it did not produce a championship, produced a career that was admired and respected by everyone who witnessed it. The relationship between Martin and the other Roush drivers evolved over the years as the team expanded and as the internal dynamics of the multi-car organization became more complex. Martin's role as the team's senior driver was not just a matter of seniority. It was a matter of example, of the standard that he set through his daily conduct and his competitive performance, and of the influence that his presence had on the culture of the organization. The younger drivers who joined the Roush team, Kenseth and Busch and Burton and Biffle, benefited from the culture that Martin had helped create, a culture of professionalism and competitive discipline that elevated everyone within the organization. The relationship with Jimmy Fennig, who served as Martin's crew chief during some of the most successful seasons of the Roush partnership, was one of the most productive driver-crew chief partnerships in the sport's recent history. Fennig's calm, methodical approach to car preparation and race strategy complemented Martin's disciplined driving style, creating a partnership that produced victories and championship contention with a consistency that reflected the quality of the collaboration. The communication between the two men, precise and efficient and built on years of shared experience, was one of the strengths of the partnership and one of the factors that made it so productive. The evolution of the points system during Martin's career had a direct impact on his championship fortunes. The original full-season points system, which was in place during the 1990 and 1998 championship campaigns, rewarded consistent performance across the full schedule, a strength that was well suited to Martin's driving style and competitive approach. The chase format, introduced in 2004, changed the championship dynamic by emphasizing performance during the final 10 races of the season, creating a more volatile and less predictable championship battle that rewarded different qualities than the full season system. The impact of the format changes on Martin's championship prospects is a matter of ongoing debate among the sports historians and analysts. Some argue that the full season system was better suited to Martin's strengths, and that the championship, if it had remained unchanged, might have eventually come his way. Others argue that the chase format, with its emphasis on late-season performance, played to Martin's strengths as a pressure performer, and that the 2009 runner-up finish was evidence of his ability to compete effectively within the new format. The financial dimensions of Martin's career reflected the broader economic evolution of the sport during the decades of his competition. The purses and the sponsorship values that existed during the early years of his career were modest by later standards, and the financial rewards of even a successful racing career were not as substantial as they would eventually become. As the sport grew, and as the television revenue and the sponsorship values increased, the financial rewards improved, and Martin's career benefited from the economic growth that accompanied the sport's expansion. The insurance and retirement planning dimensions of a NASCAR driver's career were not subjects that received much public attention during Martin's era, but they were significant practical concerns for every driver who competed at the professional level. The physical risks of the sport, combined with the relatively short competitive career span, created financial planning challenges that required careful management and that influenced the decisions that drivers made about the duration and the intensity of their competitive involvement. Martin's decision to continue competing into his 50s was driven not just by competitive ambition, but by the genuine love of racing that had animated his entire career. The love was not diminished by the championship disappointments or by the physical toll of decades of competition. It endured, sustaining him through the difficult moments and providing the motivation to continue when the rational calculation of costs and benefits might have suggested retirement. The persistence of the love, maintained through so many years and so many disappointments, was one of the most authentic and most admirable aspects of Martin's character. The first defining moment of Mark Martin's career at the Cup Series level was the 1990 season, the year that should have produced his championship, and that instead produced the most controversial penalty in the sport's recent history. The season began with the Richmond race in February, where Martin finished strong, but where the post-race technical inspection revealed the carburetor spacer issue that would alter the trajectory of his entire career. The infraction was technical in nature. The carburetor spacer, a component that sits between the carburetor and the intake manifold of the engine, was found to be marginally thicker than the specifications allowed. The team argued that the variance was within the normal manufacturing tolerances of the part, and that it did not provide a meaningful competitive advantage. NASCAR disagreed, ruling that the component was out of specification and imposing a penalty that included a fine and a deduction of 46 championship points. 46 points. In a championship system where a single race finish can swing the standings by 20 or 30 points, the penalty was enormous. It was the equivalent of losing the results of an entire race, of having one strong performance erased from the season's ledger before the championship battle had even properly begun. Martin and the Roush team protested the penalty through the available channels, but the appeal was denied, and the penalty stood. The 46 points were deducted, and Martin entered the rest of the season, carrying a deficit that he would have to overcome through on-track performance. The performance he produced was extraordinary. Martin won 3 races that season, at Rockingham, at Watkins Glen, and at Bristol. He finished in the top 5 17 times. He accumulated points with a consistency that would have been sufficient to win the championship in most years, and that demonstrated the depth of the team's competitive capabilities. The season was a testament to the quality of the Roush operation and to Martin's ability to maintain his focus and his competitive intensity under the weight of the penalty and the controversy that surrounded it. As the season progressed and the championship battle narrowed to a contest between Martin and Dale Earnhardt Sr., the significance of the 46-point penalty became increasingly apparent. The two men were trading the points, lead back and forth, separated by margins that were uncomfortably close to the size of the penalty that had been imposed. The awareness that the championship might ultimately be decided not by on-track performance, but by an off-track ruling, added a layer of tension and frustration to a season that was already among the most competitive in the sport's history. The final race of the 1990 season at Atlanta Motor Speedway was the reckoning. Martin entered the race needing a strong finish to overcome Earnhardt's points advantage. He performed well, finishing sixth, while Earnhardt finished third. The final standings showed Earnhardt winning the championship by 26 points, a margin that was smaller than the 46-point penalty that had been deducted from Martin's total at the beginning of the season. The arithmetic was inescapable. Without the penalty, Martin would have been champion. The aftermath of the 1990 season was characterized by a mixture of bitterness and resolve. Martin was bitter about the penalty, which he viewed as unjust and disproportionate, but he was also resolved to continue competing at the highest level, to prove through his on-track performance that the championship was his by right, even if it was not his by record. The determination to persevere, to come back stronger, to respond to disappointment with increased effort rather than with resignation, was the quality that defined Martin's response to the 1990 loss, and that would define his response to every subsequent disappointment of his career. The second defining moment was the 1998 season, the year in which Martin produced his most impressive statistical performance, and in which the championship was lost not through controversy but through the sheer, overwhelming dominance of another driver. Jeff Gordon, driving for Hendrick Motorsports, won 13 races that season, a total that was so far beyond what any other driver in the field could produce, that the championship was essentially decided before the final quarter of the season. Martin won 7 races, the most of any season in his career, and yet the 7 victories were not enough to overcome the historic performance of the 26-year-old Gordon. And the truth gets heavier when you examine the 1998 season in isolation. 7 victories, 68% of the races finished in the top 10, a level of consistent high-quality performance that would have been sufficient to win the championship in virtually any other season. But 1998 was not any other season. It was the season in which Jeff Gordon produced one of the 2 or 3 most dominant single-season performances in the sport's history. And Martin, despite his own extraordinary results, was the supporting actor in someone else's masterpiece. The grace with which Martin accepted the 1998 result was characteristic of his response to every championship disappointment. He congratulated Gordon publicly and sincerely. He acknowledged the quality of Gordon's performance without qualification or reservation. He did not diminish the achievement of the man who had beaten him in order to amplify his own contribution. The response was not strategic or calculated. It was the genuine expression of a character that valued sportsmanship and respect above self-promotion, and that recognized, with the clear-eyed honesty that was one of his defining traits, that the better driver had won. The third defining moment was the 2009 season, the year in which Martin, at the age of 50, produced a championship contention that was as inspiring as it was improbable, driving for Hendrick Motorsports in a part-time arrangement that involved a limited schedule and a different car number than the full-time Hendrick drivers. Martin produced results that placed him among the championship contenders in the chase format that NASCAR had implemented in 2004. The 2009 season was a revelation. Martin won 5 races, the second highest single-season total of his career, and competed for the championship with a vigor and a competitiveness that defied every assumption about the relationship between age and athletic performance. At 50 years old, an age at which most professional athletes have been retired for a decade or more, Martin was running with the best drivers in the sport and beating them with a regularity that challenged the conventional wisdom about the limits of competitive longevity. The championship battle of 2009 came down to the final race at Homestead Miami Speedway, where Martin entered with a mathematical chance to win the title. He finished the season second in the standings behind Jimmie Johnson, who was in the midst of his historic 5 consecutive championships run. The runner-up finish was another near miss, another second-place finish in a career that had accumulated more of them than any other in the sport's history. But the 2009 season was, paradoxically, one of the most celebrated of Martin's career. The championship was lost, as it had been lost so many times before. But the manner of the competition, the spectacle of a 50-year-old man racing with the best in the world and holding his own against competitors who were 20 and 25 years younger, captured the imagination of the sport and the broader sporting public in a way that the earlier championship campaigns had not. The 2009 season was a story of human possibility, a demonstration that the limits we impose on ourselves are often more restrictive than the limits that biology imposes, and that a man who commits fully to his craft can extend his competitive prime far beyond the boundaries that conventional expectations establish. The rivalry with Dale Earnhardt Sr. was one of the defining competitive relationships of Martin's career, and it was a relationship that was shaped by the 1990 championship controversy. Earnhardt, who won the championship that Martin's penalty effectively denied him, was one of the most formidable and most intimidating competitors in the sport's history. The Intimidator drove with an aggression and a physical dominance that reflected his belief that the track was a battleground and that the competitors who occupied it were adversaries to be defeated by any means necessary. Martin's approach was different. Where Earnhardt was aggressive, Martin was precise. Where Earnhardt intimidated, Martin calculated. Where Earnhardt pushed and bumped and used the car as an extension of his will, Martin conserved and planned and executed with a discipline that was the antithesis of Earnhardt's confrontational style. The contrast between the two men and the competitive battles they fought over more than a decade of competition was one of the richest competitive narratives of the era. The rivalry was not personal in the way that some rivalries in the sport have been personal. Earnhardt and Martin respected each other's abilities and conducted themselves in their interactions off the track with a civility that reflected the mutual recognition of each other's competitive stature. But the competitive tension between them was real, intensified by the 1990 championship controversy and by the awareness that every race they fought was a continuation of a larger, unresolved argument about which of them was the better driver. The rivalry with Jeff Gordon added another dimension to Martin's competitive world. Gordon, who arrived in the Cup Series in 1993, represented a new generation of drivers whose talent and whose approach to the sport were different from those of the established veterans. Gordon was young, polished, and extraordinarily fast, a driver whose natural ability behind the wheel was complemented by a media savvy and a corporate appeal that made him the face of the sport's expanding national audience. Martin competed against Gordon with the same professionalism that characterized all of his competitive relationships, acknowledging Gordon's ability without resentment and competing against him with the same intensity that he brought to every rival. The two men raced each other hard, producing some of the most exciting moments of the era, and their competitive relationship was characterized by a mutual respect that reflected the quality of the competition and the character of both men. The IROC Series victories were a distinctive element of Martin's competitive portfolio that demonstrated his versatility and his ability to perform in machines that were different from the Cup cars he drove every week. The International Race of Champions, IROC, was a series in which the top drivers from various racing disciplines competed in identically prepared cars, eliminating the equipment variable and creating a competition that was a purer test of driving ability. Martin won 4 IROC championships, more than any other driver, a record that testified to the depth of his natural talent and that provided evidence, separate from the Cup Series results, that he was among the most skilled drivers of his era. The 4 IROC titles were significant because they addressed the criticism that Martin's Cup results were a function of the Roush team's preparation. rather than of his own driving ability. In IROC, the cars were identical. The advantage belonged to the driver, not the team. And Martin, in those identically prepared cars, was the best in the world 4 times. The IROC record is one of the most compelling arguments for Martin's inclusion among the greatest drivers of his era, because it isolated the one variable, the driver's skill, and demonstrated that Martin's skill was superior to that of virtually every other driver in the sport. The Watkins Glen road course victories were another dimension of Martin's versatility. Watkins Glen, the road course in upstate New York, demanded a driving skill set that was different from the oval racing that constituted the vast majority of the Cup's schedule. The left and right turns, the elevation changes, the braking zones, and the need to manage the car through a variety of corner configurations required an adaptability that not all oval specialists possessed. Martin's victories at Watkins Glen demonstrated that his talents were not limited to the ovals but extended to the road courses as well, adding another dimension to the case for his comprehensive competitive excellence. The Bristol Motor Speedway performances were a regular highlight of Martin's season. Bristol, the half-mile concrete bowl in Tennessee, was one of the most demanding tracks on the schedule, requiring patience, car control, and the physical endurance to manage 500 laps of grinding, close quarters racing on a track where contact was inevitable and where the margin between a strong finish and a destroyed car was measured in inches. Martin's results at Bristol were consistently strong, reflecting his ability to adapt to the track's unique demands and to maintain his competitive focus through the grueling, physically punishing races that Bristol produced. The relationship between Martin and his crew chiefs over the course of his career was a significant factor in his sustained competitiveness. The crew chief relationship is one of the most important in stock car racing, and Martin's ability to work effectively with multiple crew chiefs, adapting his communication style and his feedback to the individual characteristics of each partner, was a reflection of the interpersonal skills that complemented his driving abilities. The crew chiefs who worked with Martin have spoken consistently about the quality of his feedback, the precision of his descriptions of the car's behavior, and the professionalism of his approach to the collaborative process of making the car faster. The post-Roush career that began in 2007 and that extended through the final years of Martin's competitive life demonstrated the durability of his talent and the depth of his commitment to the sport. The move to Hendrick Motorsports for the 2009 season placed Martin in one of the most successful organizations in the sport's history, providing the equipment and the organizational support that his talent deserved. The 5-win championship contending season that followed was a vindication of both the move and the man, proof that Martin's competitive capabilities had not diminished with age, and that the championship aspirations that had animated his entire career were still alive. The later seasons, from 2010 through 2013, were characterized by a gradual transition from full-time competition to a more limited role that reflected both the natural progression of an aging career and Martin's evolving relationship with the sport. He ran partial schedules, competing in selected races that interested him rather than grinding through the full calendar. The results were mixed, with occasional strong performances interspersed with finishes that reflected the reality that even the most disciplined physical conditioning cannot indefinitely delay the effects of age on competitive performance. The final Cup Series race of Martin's career at Homestead Miami Speedway at the end of the 2013 season was an unremarkable event in competitive terms, but a deeply emotional occasion for the man and for the community that had supported him. Martin climbed from the car for the last time and walked away from the Cup Series with the same quiet dignity that characterized every other aspect of his career. There was no controversy, no drama, no final act of defiance or desperation, just the simple, clean conclusion of a career that had been conducted with a professionalism and a character that set the standard for every driver in the field. The NASCAR Hall of Fame induction in 2017 was the formal recognition of a career that the racing community had long acknowledged as one of the finest in the sport's history. The induction was overdue, a delayed but deserved acknowledgement of 40 Cup victories, 5 championship runner-up finishes, and a career that had influenced the sport's culture through its emphasis on fitness, professionalism, and the quiet pursuit of excellence. The induction speech was characteristic of Martin, heartfelt, humble, and honest. He acknowledged the people who had supported him, from Jack Roush to his crew chiefs to his family, to the fans who had followed his career through its decades of competition. He spoke about the championships he had not won with the same grace and the same acceptance that he had demonstrated in real time as each near miss unfolded, and he expressed a gratitude for the sport and for the career that was genuine and deeply felt, a gratitude that was all the more moving because it was offered by a man who had received, from the sport, less than his talent and his effort deserved. The 7-win season of 1998 deserves expanded examination because it represents, in statistical terms, the finest single season of Martin's Cup Series career. The 7 victories were produced across a diverse range of tracks and conditions, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of Martin's abilities and the quality of the Roush team's preparation. The victories included wins at superspeedways, at intermediate ovals, and at short tracks, reflecting the breadth of competence that championship campaigns require. The Las Vegas Motor Speedway victory was particularly significant because it came at a track that was relatively new to the Cup schedule and that tested the team's ability to prepare for an unfamiliar venue. Martin's victory at Las Vegas demonstrated his adaptability, his ability to process new information and to develop an effective race strategy for a track that lacked the decades of accumulated setup data that the more established venues provided. The Bristol victories that punctuated Martin's career were among the most impressive on his resume because Bristol was a track that demanded the specific combination of patience, aggression, and physical endurance that separated the great from the good. The half-mile concrete bowl, with its steep banking and its narrow racing surface, was the most physically demanding track on the schedule, requiring the driver to maintain focus and physical performance through 500 laps of grinding, close-quarters competition. Martin's success at Bristol reflected his physical fitness, his mental discipline, and his ability to manage the unique challenges that the track presented. The Watkins Glen road course victories added another dimension to Martin's competitive portfolio. Watkins Glen, the challenging road course in upstate New York, demanded a different skill set from the ovals, requiring precise braking, smooth transitions between left and right turns, and the ability to manage the car's weight transfer through a variety of corner configurations. Martin's success at Watkins Glen demonstrated that his talents extended beyond the oval tracks that constituted the majority of the schedule, and that his driving abilities were comprehensive enough to encompass the road course discipline. The rivalry with Rusty Wallace, Martin's contemporary and fellow competitor during the 1990s, was another significant competitive relationship that shaped Martin's career. Wallace, who drove for the Penske organization, was a clutch and aggressive driver whose competitive style was different from Martin's more disciplined approach. The two men competed against each other for more than a decade, and their rivalry was one of the subplots that enriched the competitive narrative of the era. The competitive dynamics of the chase format that governed the championship during Martin's later career presented a different set of challenges from the full-season points system that had been in place during the earlier championship campaigns. The chase, with its reset of the championship standings and its emphasis on late-season performance, rewarded different qualities than the full-season system, placing a premium on the ability to produce peak performance during a specific window rather than on the ability to accumulate points consistently over the course of an entire season. Martin adapted to the new format, but the adaptation required adjustments to his competitive strategy and to his mental approach that reflected the fundamentally different nature of the championship battle. The 2002 championship runner-up finish, the fourth of his career, was produced under circumstances that were different from the previous near misses. The season was characterized by a consistency that was impressive in its steadiness, but that lacked the explosive victories that the previous championship campaigns had produced. Martin won one race that year at Kansas Speedway and accumulated points through a steady diet of top 10 finishes that kept him in championship contention throughout the season. The runner-up finish behind Tony Stewart was another addition to the growing list of near misses that defined Martin's championship story. The relationship between Martin and the Roush engineering staff was a critical dimension of the team's competitive capabilities. The engineers who worked on Martin's car brought a technical sophistication to the team that complemented Martin's driving talent, and the collaborative relationship between the driver and the engineering staff produced a continuous cycle of improvement that kept the team competitive season after season. Martin's feedback, precise and actionable, was the raw material from which the engineers crafted their adjustments, and the quality of the feedback was one of the factors that made the partnership so productive. The tyre management skills that Martin demonstrated throughout his career were a significant competitive advantage, particularly on tracks where tyre degradation was a major factor in the race outcome. Martin's smooth driving style placed less stress on the tyres than the more aggressive styles of some of his competitors, preserving the tyre's performance potential over longer runs and giving him an advantage in the closing laps when other drivers' tyres were beginning to fade. The tyre management was a function of both technique and strategy, the ability to drive the car at high speed while minimizing the forces that degraded the tyre surfaces, and the discipline to accept a slightly slower pace in the early laps in exchange for a significant advantage in the closing stages. The pit strategy dimension of Martin's racing was another area where the intelligence and the discipline that characterized his approach produced competitive advantages. The decisions about when to pit, how much fuel to take, and whether to change 2 tyres or 4 were complex strategic calculations that could determine the outcome of a race. Martin and his crew chiefs consistently made good strategic decisions, producing pit strategies that placed the car in favorable positions and that complemented the on-track driving performance that Martin provided. The qualification performances that produced Martin's 56 career poles were a dimension of his career that deserves particular emphasis. Qualifying in the Cup Series is a test of outright speed, the ability to produce a single lap performance that extracts the absolute maximum from the car and the driver. Martin's qualifying abilities were among the best in the sport's history, a testament to his raw speed and his ability to manage the high-risk, high-reward dynamics of a qualifying lap. The poles were not just statistical achievements. They were demonstrations of speed that complemented the strategic intelligence of his race day performances, and that provided the team with the competitive advantage of starting at the front of the field. The superspeedway racing dimension of Martin's career, while not the most celebrated aspect of his resume, included moments of high drama and impressive performance. Martin competed effectively at Daytona and Talladega, the sport's 2 largest and fastest tracks, producing strong finishes that contributed to his championship point totals, and that demonstrated his ability to manage the complex drafting dynamics and the pack racing conditions that superspeedway events produced. The superspeedway performances were another dimension of the comprehensive competitive ability that characterized Martin's career. The evolution of Martin's driving style over the course of his 3-decade career reflected both the natural maturation process and the changing demands of the competitive environment. In the early years, Martin drove with an aggressiveness that reflected the influence of his dirt track and ASA background, attacking the track with a directness that sometimes produced spectacular results and sometimes produced unnecessary damage. As the career progressed and as the competitive landscape evolved, Martin's style became more refined, more disciplined, and more strategically sophisticated, reflecting the lessons he had learned from years of championship contention and from the experience of competing against the best drivers in the sport. The maturation of the driving style was accompanied by a maturation of the competitive approach. The early career Martin was a driver who attacked every race with the same aggressive intensity, pushing hard from the opening lap and sustaining the effort through the full distance. The mature Martin was a driver who managed his races with a strategic intelligence that recognized the value of conservation, of patience, and of the selective deployment of effort at the moments when it would produce the greatest competitive return. The evolution was a reflection of the learning process that every great driver undergoes, the process of transforming raw talent into refined competitive excellence through the accumulation of experience and the application of intelligence. The Darlington Raceway performances were another significant element of Martin's career. Darlington, the egg-shaped 1 3/8 oval in South Carolina, was the track that most rewarded the smoothness and the precision that were the hallmarks of Martin's driving style. The narrow racing surface, the abrasive track surface that consumed tires, and the close proximity of the outside wall demanded exactly the kind of disciplined, precise driving that Martin provided. His victories at Darlington were among the most satisfying of his career, demonstrations of the skills that made him one of the most complete drivers of his era. The Charlotte Motor Speedway performances during the 2 annual Cup Series events at the 1.5-mile track in Concord, North Carolina, were consistent highlights of Martin's season. Charlotte was the capital of the NASCAR world, the track where the sport's biggest events were held, and where the competition was always at its most intense. Martin's results at Charlotte were consistently strong, reflecting his ability to prepare for and compete at the highest level on the sport's most visible stage. The media relationship that Martin maintained throughout his career was characterized by a professionalism that the media community appreciated, even when it did not always produce the colorful, quotable content that headlines required. Martin was honest in his interviews, thoughtful in his assessments of races and championship battles, and respectful of the media's role in covering the sport. He did not engage in the kind of confrontational behavior toward reporters that some of his contemporaries employed, and the result was a media relationship that was cordial, productive, and reflective of the mutual respect that characterized Martin's approach to every professional interaction. The physical conditioning program that Martin maintained throughout his career was detailed and comprehensive, encompassing weight training, cardiovascular conditioning, flexibility work, and nutritional management. The program was designed not just to maintain his racing performance, but to support his overall health and well-being, reflecting Martin's conviction that the pursuit of excellence in one dimension of life required attention to excellence in all dimensions. The program evolved over the decades as the science of physical conditioning advanced and as the specific demands of Martin's body changed with age, but the commitment to the program remained constant, a daily discipline that was as much a part of Martin's professional routine as the time he spent in the car or in the shop. The competitive landscape of the 2009 season, Martin's last championship campaign, included some of the most talented drivers in the sport's recent history. Jimmie Johnson, who was pursuing his 4th consecutive championship and who would ultimately win 5 in a row, was the dominant force in the field, producing results that reflected the extraordinary quality of the Hendrick organization and the driving talent that Johnson possessed. Jeff Gordon, still competitive in the latter stages of his career, was another Hendrick teammate whose presence in the field elevated the quality of the competition. Tony Stewart, Kevin Harvick, Denny Hamlin, and Kyle Busch were among the other drivers who competed for the championship that year, creating a competitive environment that was among the deepest and most talented in the sport's modern history. Against this field at the age of 50, Mark Martin produced 5 victories and a runner-up championship finish. The achievement is extraordinary by any standard, regardless of the era or the competitive context. At an age when most professional athletes have been retired for a decade or more, Martin was competing at the highest level of his sport and producing results that placed him ahead of every other driver in the field except one. The performance was a testament to the physical fitness, the driving talent, and the competitive intelligence that had sustained his career for more than 3 decades, and it provided the statistical capstone to a body of work that was among the most impressive in the sport's history. The relationship between Martin and the fans at specific tracks across the Cup schedule created a geography of support that reflected the distribution and the character of his fan base. At certain tracks, particularly the short tracks and the older, more traditional venues where the sport's working-class roots were most visible, Martin's fan following was particularly strong, reflecting the resonance between his character and the values of the communities that hosted those events. The cheers that greeted his car during driver introductions at these tracks were not the loudest in the field, but they were among the most heartfelt offered by fans whose loyalty was built on years of shared experience and mutual respect. The Sears Point and later Infineon Raceway performances at the road course in Sonoma, California, were another dimension of Martin's versatility. The Northern California track, set in the wine country hills of Sonoma County, presented challenges that were different from any other venue on the schedule, including elevation changes, blind corners, and a surface that varied in grip from one section to another. Martin's results at Sonoma were competitive, contributing to the evidence that his driving abilities were comprehensive enough to encompass the full range of competitive challenges that the Cup schedule presented. The New Hampshire Motor Speedway races were consistently strong performances for Martin, who found the characteristics of the flat, 1-mile oval in Loudon well suited to his driving style. The track rewarded patience, precise car placement, and the ability to manage tire wear over long runs, qualities that Martin possessed in abundance. His results at New Hampshire contributed to the impression that he was a driver whose skills were particularly well matched to the technically demanding, patience-rewarding tracks that constituted a significant portion of the schedule. The pit crew performances that supported Martin's on-track efforts were a critical component of the team's competitive success. The pit stops in the Cup Series are high-pressure, time-critical operations that require the coordinated efforts of 6 to 7 crew members performing their tasks in a sequence that has been practiced hundreds of times. The quality of the pit stops can determine the outcome of a race, and the Martin team's consistently strong pit performances were a reflection of the preparation and the professionalism that characterized the entire operation. The engineering relationship between Martin and his crew chiefs evolved over the course of the Roush partnership, reflecting the changing demands of the competitive landscape and the evolving understanding of the factors that contribute to on-track performance. The early years were characterized by a more intuitive approach, with the crew chief relying heavily on Martin's feedback and on the accumulated experience of the team to guide the setup decisions. The later years incorporated more data-driven analysis, with the team using increasingly sophisticated tools to supplement the driver's feedback with objective measurements of the car's behavior. Martin's ability to work effectively within both paradigms, the intuitive and the analytical, was a reflection of the breadth of his professional skills and his willingness to adapt to changing methods and technologies. He was not a driver who resisted the introduction of new analytical tools, or who insisted on maintaining the traditional approaches that had served him earlier in his career. He was a driver who recognized the value of the new tools and who incorporated them into his competitive arsenal, alongside the intuitive skills and the experiential knowledge that remained the foundation of his driving ability. The competitive intensity of the fields that Martin raced against during the peak years of his career, the 1990s and the early 2000s, was one of the highest in the sport's history. The drivers who competed during this period, Earnhardt, Gordon, Jarrett, Wallace, Labonte, Stewart, Johnson, and a dozen others, constituted a generation of talent that was, by almost any measure, the deepest and most diverse in the sport's modern history. Martin competed against all of them for more than 2 decades, and his ability to maintain his position among the top competitors throughout this period was a testament to the quality and the durability of his competitive abilities. The Dale Jarrett rivalry was one of the quieter but more significant competitive relationships of Martin's career. Jarrett, who won the 1999 championship, was a driver whose professionalism and character were similar to Martin's own, and the competition between the two men was conducted with a mutual respect that reflected the shared values of the competitors. The Jarrett-Martin dynamic was not the kind of rivalry that generated headlines or media attention, but it was a genuine, sustained competitive relationship that enriched the racing during the years in which both men were competing at their highest levels. The Terry Labonte friendship was another dimension of Martin's personal and professional world that deserves mention. Labonte, the two-time champion known as the Iceman, was a driver whose quiet professional approach to competition mirrored Martin's own, and the friendship between the two men was one of the most enduring personal relationships in the Cup Series garage. The friendship was built on shared values and mutual respect, and it provided both men with a source of support and companionship that sustained them through the demands of a professional racing career. The sponsor obligations that accompanied Martin's career were another dimension of the professional demands that he managed with characteristic professionalism. The primary sponsors, who invested millions of dollars in the team's competitive effort, expected not just on-track performance, but a range of off-track activities, including corporate appearances, promotional events, media interviews, and fan engagement activities. Martin fulfilled these obligations with the same thoroughness and the same professionalism that he brought to his driving, understanding that the sponsor relationships were essential to the financial health of the team and that the maintenance of these relationships was part of his professional responsibility. The economic impact of Martin's career on the Roush Racing organization extended beyond the direct sponsorship revenue that his car attracted. Martin's competitive success and his professional reputation enhanced the overall brand value of the Roush organization, attracting sponsors and partners to the team's other cars and contributing to the growth of the organization from a single-car operation to a multi-car powerhouse. The economic contribution was another dimension of Martin's legacy that extended beyond his own competitive results and that reflected the broader impact of his career on the sport and the organizations within it. The 2005 season was another year of competitive consistency for Martin, who continued to produce results that placed him among the top drivers in the field. The season included strong performances at a variety of tracks, demonstrating the continued quality of the Roush team's preparation and Martin's ability to extract competitive results from the equipment available to him. The season did not produce a championship contention, but it maintained the standard of competitive excellence that Martin and the Roush team had established over nearly 2 decades of partnership. The 2006 season, Martin's final year with Roush, was bittersweet in its emotional dimensions. The season was competitive, with Martin producing results that reflected the quality of the team's preparation and the depth of his driving talent. But the season was also the conclusion of a partnership that had been one of the most productive and most enduring in the sport's history, and the awareness that the end was approaching added an emotional weight to every race and every result. The departure from Roush was handled with the dignity and the mutual respect that had characterized the partnership throughout its duration. Both men acknowledged the significance of what they had built together and expressed their gratitude for the years of shared competition and mutual support. The departure was not acrimonious. It was instead a recognition that the competitive dynamics of the sport had evolved in ways that required a change, and that the change, however painful, was necessary for both parties to continue pursuing their competitive ambitions. The brief stint with Ginn Racing and subsequently with Dale Earnhardt Incorporated in 2007 and 2008 was a transitional period that preceded the move to Hendrick Motorsports that would produce the remarkable 2009 season. The transitional years were not among Martin's most competitive, reflecting the challenges of adapting to new teams and new equipment in a sport where the relationship between driver and team is so critical to competitive success. The arrival at Hendrick Motorsports for the 2009 season was, from a competitive standpoint, the right move at the right time. Hendrick was the most successful organization in the sport, with a track record of championships and a level of organizational excellence that was unmatched in the Cup Series. The marriage of Martin's driving talent with Hendrick's engineering resources produced results that were as impressive as any that Martin had achieved during the peak of the Roush years. The relationship with Rick Hendrick, the team owner, was characterized by a mutual respect that reflected the shared values of the two men. Hendrick, who had built his organization through decades of investment and competitive commitment, recognized in Martin a driver whose character and whose competitive abilities were worthy of the Hendrick standard. The partnership, while shorter in duration than the Roush partnership, was productive and satisfying for both parties, producing 5 victories and a championship runner-up finish that constituted one of the finest seasons of Martin's career. The relationship with Jeff Gordon and Jimmie Johnson, Martin's Hendrick teammates, during the 2009 season was another dimension of the Hendrick experience that enriched the final years of Martin's career. Gordon and Johnson, both multiple champions, provided Martin with teammates whose competitive excellence and whose professional conduct matched his own. The internal team dynamics at Hendrick, characterized by data sharing, collaborative engineering, and a culture of competitive excellence, provided Martin with an environment that was optimized for high-level performance. The 5 victories of the 2009 season were distributed across a range of tracks that demonstrated the continued breadth of Martin's competitive abilities. Wins at Darlington, at Dover, at Las Vegas, and at other venues reflected the ability to perform on different types of tracks under different conditions, a versatility that had been one of the hallmarks of his career from the beginning. The victories were earned against fields that included the sport's best active drivers, confirming that Martin's competitive capabilities, at the age of 50, were still among the finest in the field. The final stages of the 2009 championship chase were among the most dramatic and most emotionally resonant moments of Martin's career. As the chase progressed and as the standings narrowed, the possibility of a championship that had eluded Martin for 20 years appeared to be within reach. The fans, who had followed Martin's championship quest through its decades of disappointment, rallied behind him with a fervor that reflected the depth of the emotional investment they had made in his career. The support was vocal, visible, and deeply felt, a communal expression of the hope that the career would finally be completed by the achievement that had been denied for so long. The hope was not fulfilled. Jimmie Johnson's excellence during the closing races of the chase was too consistent and too overwhelming to be overcome, and the championship, Martin's 5th runner-up finish, went to Johnson instead. The disappointment was sharp and final, the last in a series of near misses that had defined Martin's relationship with the sport's highest prize. The response from Martin was characteristic, gracious, honest, and dignified. He congratulated Johnson. He acknowledged the quality of the competition, and he expressed, with the quiet conviction that defined his character, his gratitude for the career and the experiences that the sport had provided. The deeper truth about Mark Martin is that his career without a championship is not a story of failure. It is a story about the inadequacy of the championship as a measure of a driver's worth. The championship is one metric. It is an important metric, but it is not the only metric, and the elevation of the championship above all other measures of competitive excellence produces a distorted picture of the sport's history that undervalues the contributions of drivers whose careers, viewed in their totality, were among the finest the sport has ever witnessed. Let that sink in. Mark Martin won 40 Cup Series races. He finished second in the championship standings 5 times. He won 4 IRO championships in identically prepared cars. He competed at the Cup level for more than 3 decades, maintaining a level of competitive performance that was extraordinary in its duration and in its consistency. He was respected by his peers as one of the most talented and most professional drivers in the sport. And yet, because the championship eluded him, his career is often categorized as incomplete, as falling short of the standard that the sport's other great drivers have established. The categorization is unfair. It is unfair because it applies a binary standard, champion or not champion, to a career that resists binary classification. It is unfair because it ignores the circumstances that contributed to the championship absences, the 46-point penalty in 1990, the historic dominance of Jeff Gordon in 1998, the 5 consecutive championships run of Jimmie Johnson in 2009. It is unfair because it measures Martin against a standard that many objectively lesser drivers have met through circumstances that were more favourable, and it finds him wanting based on a metric that rewards luck and timing as much as it rewards talent and effort. The deeper truth is that the championship metric is a flawed instrument for evaluating individual competitive excellence, because the championship is not determined solely by the performance of the individual driver. It is determined by the performance of the entire team, by the reliability of the equipment, by the quality of the competition, by the specific configuration of the rules and the point system, and by the accumulated effects of chance events, crashes, mechanical failures, weather interruptions that can swing the standings by margins that exceed the differences in the driver's actual abilities. Mark Martin lost the 1990 championship by 26 points, a margin that was smaller than the penalty he received for a carburetor spacer infraction. He lost the 1998 championship to a driver who won 13 races in a single season, a performance that was historically extraordinary and that would have defeated any other driver in the field, regardless of their talent or their effort. He lost the 2009 championship to a driver who was in the midst of winning 5 consecutive titles, a run that is unmatched in the sport's history. In each case, the championship was lost, not because Martin was deficient, but because the circumstances were exceptional. Let that sink in. The 5 championship runner-up finishes are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of sustained excellence, of a career that was consistently among the best in the sport, across multiple decades and multiple competitive eras. The runner-up finishes demonstrate that Martin was, year after year, among the 2 or 3 best drivers in the sport, a level of consistency that very few drivers in any era have matched. The fact that the final step, from second to first, was never taken does not diminish the quality of the journey. It simply means that the journey ended one step short of its destination, and the difference between that step and the destination is smaller than the binary champion or not classification suggests. But here is what makes this unforgettable. The psychological dimension of the repeated near misses is one of the most remarkable and most underappreciated aspects of Martin's career. The ability to compete at the championship level, to come close to winning the sport's highest prize, to fail to win it, and then to return the following season with the same commitment and the same competitive intensity, requires a psychological resilience that goes beyond what most athletes are called upon to demonstrate. The disappointment of a single championship loss is difficult enough to process. The accumulated disappointment of 5 championship losses, spread across nearly 2 decades of competition, is a burden that would have crushed most competitors, and that would have eroded the motivation and the focus that championship-level performance demands. Martin did not erode, he endured. He processed each disappointment with the quiet grace that defined his character, and he returned to competition with a determination that was not diminished by the weight of the previous failures. The psychological resilience was not a function of emotional detachment or of indifference to the outcome. Martin cared deeply about winning the championship. The desire was genuine, intense, and sustained across the full span of his career. The resilience lay not in the absence of the desire, but in the ability to continue pursuing it despite the repeated frustration of its fulfillment. The personal cost of the championship pursuit was significant, and was borne not just by Martin but by the family and the friends who supported him throughout his career. Arlene Martin, his wife, was the steady presence who sustained the family through the demands and the disappointments of a professional racing career that lasted more than 3 decades. The marriage endured as the career endured through the championship, near misses, and the personal challenges, the constant demands of a lifestyle that left limited room for the quiet pleasures of private life. The relationship between Martin and his son, Matt, who pursued his own racing career, added another dimension to the personal cost and the personal meaning of the championship pursuit. The father's career, with its extraordinary achievements and its equally extraordinary disappointments, was a model and a cautionary tale for the son, a demonstration of both the rewards and the costs of a life devoted to the pursuit of competitive excellence. The relationship between father and son was a private matter, largely shielded from the public scrutiny that accompanied the rest of Martin's career, but the influence of the father's example on the son's choices and the son's development was unmistakable. The physical fitness commitment that Martin maintained throughout his career was not just a competitive strategy, it was an expression of a philosophy of life that valued discipline, self-improvement, and the continuous pursuit of one's best performance in every dimension of existence. Martin did not train to win championships. He trained because the training was an expression of who he was, a physical manifestation of the mental and emotional discipline that characterized his approach to everything he did. The fitness was a metaphor, a visible symbol of the invisible qualities, the determination, the discipline, the refusal to accept mediocrity that made Martin one of the most admired figures in the sport. The sobriety that Martin maintained throughout the later decades of his career was another dimension of the discipline and the self-awareness that defined his character. The early struggles with alcohol, addressed with the courage and the honesty that have been described, were a crucible that shaped the man who emerged from them. The Martin who competed in the Cup Series from the late 1980s onward was a man who had confronted his own weaknesses, who had made the difficult choice to change, and who had maintained that change through decades of the pressures and the temptations that professional competition and public life present. The sobriety was not just a personal achievement, it was a statement of values, a demonstration that the pursuit of excellence requires not just talent and effort, but the willingness to confront and to overcome the personal obstacles that can undermine both. The respect that Martin earned from his peers was one of the most consistent and most unanimous assessments in the sport's recent history. The drivers who competed against him, from Earnhardt to Gordon to Johnson to Stewart to Harvick and beyond, universally acknowledged Martin as one of the most talented, most professional, and most admirable competitors they had ever faced. The respect was not conditional on the championship results. It was based on the quality of the competition, the character of the man, and the example he set for the entire field through decades of sustained excellence. The assessment of Martin by his peers is, in many ways, more telling than the championship results. The championship is determined by a points system that incorporates many variables beyond the driver's individual ability. The respect of peers is determined by direct observation, by the experience of competing against a man at close range, at high speed, under conditions of extreme stress, and by the judgment of professionals who are uniquely qualified to evaluate competitive talent. When the professionals unanimously declare a man to be among the best, the declaration carries a weight that no statistical analysis can match. The deeper truth about Mark Martin is that he was one of the greatest drivers in the history of NASCAR, and the absence of a championship does not alter this assessment. The greatness was real. It was demonstrated through 40 victories, 5 championship runner-up finishes, 4 IROHE championships, and a career of more than 3 decades conducted at the highest level of the sport. It was validated by the unanimous respect of his peers and by the admiration of a fan base that recognized, in Martin's career, the qualities they valued most. And it was expressed through a character, a professionalism, and a grace under pressure that set the standard for every driver who followed. The championship would have been the culmination. The recognition would have been complete. The asterisk would have been removed. But the absence of the championship does not diminish the career. It simply adds a dimension of poignancy that makes the story more human, more relatable, and ultimately more meaningful than a straightforward narrative of achievement and triumph could have been. The man who came closest without winning is not a figure of pity. He is a figure of admiration. He is the driver whose career demonstrates that the measure of a man is not found in the trophies on his shelf, but in the effort he gave, the character he maintained, and the respect he earned from the people who knew him best. What does Mark Martin's legacy mean to the sport of NASCAR? The question invites a reflection that goes beyond the statistical record and into the philosophical territory, where the meaning of competition and the criteria for evaluating competitive lives are, examined, and debated. The most obvious dimension of the legacy is the competitive record itself. 40 Cup Series victories, 5 championship runner-up finishes, 4 IRO titles, more than 880 career starts. A career span that exceeded 3 decades. The numbers describe a body of work that is, by any objective measure, one of the most impressive in the sport's history. The numbers are permanent, embedded in the record books in a form that will endure for as long as the sport exists. But the numbers alone do not capture the full scope of Martin's contribution to the sport. The contribution extends beyond the victories and the statistics to encompass the cultural influence that Martin exerted through his example, the way he conducted himself, the values he demonstrated, and the standard he established for professional conduct in a sport that has not always valued professionalism as highly as it has valued aggression and spectacle. The fitness legacy is perhaps the most tangible dimension of Martin's cultural influence. Before Martin, the idea that a Cup Series driver needed to maintain a rigorous physical conditioning program was not widely accepted. The drivers of earlier eras relied on natural ability and on the physical toughness that their backgrounds had provided, and the concept of a dedicated, systematic approach to physical fitness was viewed by many as unnecessary or even eccentric. Martin changed this perception, demonstrating through his own career that physical fitness was not just a personal choice, but a competitive advantage, and that the driver who invested in his conditioning could maintain his performance at levels that unconditioned drivers could not match. The influence of Martin's fitness example is visible in every Cup Series garage today. The modern driver is expected to maintain a level of physical conditioning that would have been remarkable in the era before Martin established the standard. The training programs, the nutritional regimens, the attention to recovery, and to the optimization of physical performance that are now standard in the Cup Series can be traced, at least in part, to the example that Martin set through decades of demonstrating the competitive value of fitness. The professionalism legacy is equally significant, if less immediately visible. Martin's career was conducted with a level of professional conduct that was remarkable for its consistency and its depth. He was respectful of his competitors, courteous to the media, grateful to his fans, and dignified in his response to both victory and defeat. The professionalism was not an act. It was the genuine expression of a character that valued these qualities and that maintained them through decades of the pressures and the provocations that professional competition generates. The influence of Martin's professionalism on the sports culture is more difficult to quantify than the influence of his fitness example, but it is no less real. The standard he established for how a competitor should conduct himself, on the track and off it, has influenced the behavior and the self-presentation of subsequent generations of drivers, creating a culture that values respect and dignity alongside the competitive aggression that the sport demands. The Rash Racing partnership legacy is another dimension of Martin's contribution that deserves preservation. The nearly two-decade partnership between Martin and Jack Roush was one of the most productive and most enduring collaborations in the sport's history, producing 40 victories and 5 championship runner-up finishes whilst establishing Roush Racing as one of the premier organizations in the Cup Series. The partnership demonstrated that sustained competitive excellence could be achieved through the alignment of a talented driver with a committed team owner, and it provided a model for the kind of long-term, loyalty-based professional relationship that the sport's increasingly transactional culture sometimes undervalues. The 2009 season, Martin's last championship campaign, holds a special place in the legacy because of the story it tells about human possibility. A 50-year-old man competing for the Cup Series championship against drivers who are in their 20s and 30s, winning 5 races and finishing second in the final standings. The story is inspiring in its own right, but it is made more inspiring by the context of the career that preceded it, the decades of near misses and disappointments that the 50-year-old had endured, and that had not diminished his competitive fire or his commitment to excellence. The philosophical dimension of Martin's legacy reaches its deepest resonance when we consider what his career teaches about the nature of success and the relationship between effort and outcome. Martin's career demonstrates that the most worthy competitors do not always win the final prize, that the relationship between merit and reward is imperfect, and that the measure of a career is found not just in the championships won, but in the quality of the effort given, and the character maintained through the full span of the competition. This is a lesson that extends beyond the world of racing, a lesson about the human experience in its most fundamental form. All of us, in our own pursuits and in our own ways, experience the gap between effort and outcome, between what we deserve and what we receive, between what we hope for and what the world provides. Martin's career is a model for how to navigate that gap with grace, with dignity, and with the continued commitment to excellence that the gap itself can so easily erode. The community of drivers, team owners, mechanics, and fans who constituted the NASCAR world during Martin's career has been unanimous in its assessment of his place in the sport's history. He belongs among the greats. Not despite the absence of a championship, not because the absence somehow makes his career more sympathetic or more human. He belongs among the greats because the quality of his competition, the consistency of his performance, the breadth of his abilities, and the character of his conduct place him there, and because the respect he earned from the people who knew him best, the competitors who shared the track with him, confirms that placement beyond any reasonable doubt. The Batesville connection that anchored Martin's personal life throughout his career remains the geographic and emotional foundation of his identity. The small Arkansas city that raised him continues to claim him as its most famous son, and the connection between the community and the driver reflects the values that both share: hard work, modesty, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth without needing to announce it. The community's pride in Martin's achievements is a form of local tribute that mirrors the broader racing community's assessment, a recognition that the man and the career he built deserve to be honored and remembered. In the end, the story of Mark Martin is a story about what remains when the championship is not there. What remains is 40 victories, each one earned through the application of talent and effort, and the collaboration of a dedicated team. What remains is 5 championship runner-up finishes, each one a testament to a season of competition conducted at the highest level of the sport. What remains is 4 IROC championships, each one a demonstration of pure driving ability in identically prepared machines. What remains is a career that lasted more than 3 decades, and that was conducted with a professionalism and a character that set the standard for every driver in the field. What remains is respect. The respect of the men who raced against him, who knew his speed and his character from the closest possible vantage point, and who have, without exception, declared him one of the finest competitors they ever faced. The respect of the fans who followed his career through its decades of competition and who recognized in him the qualities they valued most: effort, consistency, dignity, and the refusal to be defined by disappointment. The respect of the sport itself, expressed through the Hall of Fame induction that formally acknowledged what the racing community had known for years, that Mark Martin belonged among the immortals. What remains is the example of a man who pursued the highest goal in his sport, with an intensity that never diminished, who came close enough to touch it 5 times, who was denied each time by circumstances that ranged from the controversial to the simply extraordinary, and who responded to each denial with the same grace, the same professionalism, and the same determination to try again that had characterized every other aspect of his career. The championship would have completed the record. There is no point in pretending otherwise. The championship is the prize that the sport values above all others, and its absence from Martin's resume is a fact that cannot be wished away or argued into insignificance. The absence is real, the weight of it is real, and the disappointment that Martin felt each time the championship slipped away was real and was acknowledged with the honesty that defined his public statements. But the absence of the championship does not define the career. The career defines itself through the victories and the runner-up finishes and the IROC titles and the decades of sustained excellence and the unanimous respect of peers and the Hall of Fame induction and the example of professionalism, and character that influenced every driver who followed. Mark Martin came closest without winning, 5 times. The number is a measure of heartbreak. It is also a measure of excellence, because the only drivers who come close to winning are the ones who are good enough to contend, and the driver who contends 5 times, across a span of nearly 20 years, against fields that included some of the greatest competitors the sport has ever produced, is a driver whose career, championship or no championship, commands respect. The man from Batesville, Arkansas, the driver of the number 6 Viagra Ford, the IROC champion, the physical fitness pioneer, the professional's professional, the driver who came closest more times than any other man in history without ever claiming the prize. They called him Mark Martin, and the name, which carried no championship suffix and no intimidating nickname, was spoken with a respect and an admiration that no championship could have enhanced, because the respect was earned not by a title but by a life, a career, and a character that were, in every dimension that matters, worthy of the highest honor the sport can bestow. 40 victories, 5 runner-up finishes, 0 championships, and a legacy that is, paradoxically, more powerful and more enduring than many legacies that include the championship, because the legacy teaches us something that championship stories cannot. It teaches us that the value of a life is not found in the final result, but in the quality of the effort, in the character of the competitor, and in the grace with which the journey is traveled, regardless of where it ends. The journey ends here, but the example endures, and the respect, the deep, genuine, universal respect that Mark Martin earned through 40 years of competition at the highest level, is the truest measure of a career that needed no championship to be complete. End of script. The influence of Martin's career on the sport's understanding of competitive longevity is one of the most significant and most lasting dimensions of his legacy. Before Martin, the conventional wisdom held that Cup Series drivers peaked in their 30s and declined significantly in their 40s. Martin demolished this assumption, producing championship-caliber performances well into his 40s and competing effectively into his 50s. The demolition of the assumption has had lasting consequences for the sport, encouraging drivers to extend their careers beyond the age at which earlier generations had retired, and motivating the development of the physical, conditioning, and health management practices that make extended careers possible. The comparison between Martin's career and the careers of other drivers who never won a Cup Series championship is instructive. Among the drivers who competed in the Cup Series during Martin's era and who did not win a championship, Martin stands alone in terms of the quality and the duration of his competitiveness. Other drivers had successful careers without winning the title, but none of them finished second 5 times, none of them won 40 races, and none of them maintained championship-caliber performance for as long as Martin did. The uniqueness of his position in the sport's history, the greatest driver to never win the championship, is a distinction that is as meaningful in its own way as the distinction of being the greatest driver who did win it. The emotional dimension of the retirement was handled with the same quiet dignity that had characterized every other aspect of Martin's career. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no series of ceremonial final appearances at tracks across the country. Martin simply competed in his final season, acknowledged the approaching end with the grace and the acceptance that his character demanded, and walked away from the sport with the knowledge that he had given everything he had, and that the results, while not including the championship he had sought, were a body of work of which any competitor could be proud. The post-retirement life that Martin has built has included continued involvement in the racing world through mentoring, appearances, and occasional competitive outings in vintage and exhibition events. The involvement reflects the enduring love of racing that animated his entire career, the love that survives the disappointments and the near misses and the physical toll of decades of competition. Martin's continued presence in the racing community is a source of comfort and of inspiration for the fans who supported him throughout his career and who continue to value the example that his career provides. The question of what Mark Martin's career means to the sport. ultimately, is a question about values. The championship is a value. Winning is a value. The accumulation of trophies and records and titles is a value that the sport celebrates and that the fans embrace. But there are other values that Martin's career represents, values that are at least as important and at least as worthy of celebration. Consistency, professionalism, respect, dignity, the willingness to pursue excellence even when excellence does not produce the ultimate reward, the courage to return, year after year, to the pursuit of a goal that continues to elude you, without complaint and without excuse. These values are not consolation prizes. They are not the values of a man who has settled for less than the best. They are the values of a man who has given his best, who has been measured against the highest standard, and who has been found worthy of that standard by every measure except one. The one measure that is missing, the championship, is significant. Its absence is real. But the values that are present, the values that Martin's career embodied, and that his character demonstrated, are sufficient to place him among the greatest and most admired figures in the sport's history. The racing community's continued reverence for Martin's career, expressed through the Hall of Fame induction and through the ongoing respect of his peers and the affection of his fans, is the truest measure of a legacy that transcends the championship question. The community does not honor Martin despite the absence of a championship. It honors him because the presence of everything else, the talent, the effort, the character, the grace, is sufficient to warrant the honor and more. The Batesville boy who became the Silver Fox of the Cup Series, who won 40 races and came second 5 times, and who never once, in more than 3 decades of competition, compromised the values that his community had instilled in him, has earned a place in the sport's pantheon that no championship could enhance, and that no absence of a championship can diminish. The concept of the best to never win, which has been applied to Mark Martin more frequently and more unanimously than to any other driver in the sport's history, is a designation that carries both honor and burden. The honor is in the acknowledgement of excellence, the recognition that Martin's competitive abilities placed him among the sport's best by every measure except the final one. The burden is in the reminder of the absence, the implication that the career, for all of its achievements, was somehow incomplete, that the 40 victories and the 5 runner-up finishes were preludes to a conclusion that never arrived. Martin has addressed this designation with the same grace and the same honesty that have characterized every other aspect of his public life. He has acknowledged that the championship would have been welcome, that the pursuit of it animated his career, and that the failure to achieve it was a source of genuine disappointment. But he has also expressed a gratitude for the career he had, a recognition that the opportunities he was given, the experiences he accumulated, and the relationships he built were sufficient to constitute a life of extraordinary richness and meaning, with or without the championship, that would have completed the competitive record. The gratitude is not resignation. It is perspective, the wisdom of a man who has lived long enough and experienced enough to understand that the value of a life is not found in any single achievement, but in the totality of the effort given and the character maintained across the full span of the journey. Martin's perspective is not the perspective of a man who has given up on his ambitions. It is the perspective of a man who has pursued his ambitions with everything he had, and who has found, in the pursuit itself, a satisfaction that the outcome alone could not have provided. The final chapter of Martin's story is not a chapter of defeat. It is a chapter of completion, of a career that was conducted with a professionalism and a character that set the standard for the sport and that earned the respect and the admiration of every person who witnessed it. The story is complete, the championship is absent, but the legacy is whole, built not on the presence of a trophy, but on the presence of values, of character, of the quiet, relentless, deeply admirable pursuit of excellence that Mark Martin demonstrated every day of his extraordinary career. The man from Batesville, Arkansas, the number 6, the driver who won 40 races and came second 5 times, the fitness pioneer, the professional's professional, the best driver to never win the Cup Series championship. The title is his. It is not the title he sought. but it is a title that carries a weight and a dignity that few other titles in the sport can match, because it acknowledges not just the achievement but the effort, not just the result but the character, not just the destination reached but the quality of the journey travelled. Mark Martin, the driver who came closest without winning, and the driver whose career, championship or no championship, stands as one of the finest and most admirable in the history of American motorsport. The sport that Mark Martin served for more than 3 decades is a sport that measures its champions by the trophies they hold. The measure is fair as far as it goes. The championship is the ultimate prize, and the drivers who win it deserve the recognition that the achievement confers. But the measure is incomplete because it excludes from the pantheon of greatness those competitors whose careers, viewed in their totality, were among the finest the sport has ever produced, but whose championship fortunes were determined by circumstances that lay beyond their control. Mark Martin's career is the most prominent example of this exclusion, and his legacy is the most compelling argument for expanding the criteria by which competitive greatness is evaluated. The 40 victories, the 5 runner-up finishes, the 4 IRO championships, the 3 decades of sustained excellence, the physical fitness revolution that he pioneered, the professional standard that he established, the character and the grace that he maintained through every triumph and every disappointment. These are not the credentials of a man who fell short. These are the credentials of a man who reached heights that most competitors can only imagine, and who did so with a dignity and a determination that the sport will remember long after the championship records have been superseded by the achievements of future generations.